The Death of Magic by Marisa Mills and Drake Mason. Chapter 1. I shifted onto my knees and lifted the curtain of my carriage a sliver, so I could catch the first glimpse of the Studium Generale, the academy for fledgling mages. As the large towers, built of stained glass and lead frames, sparkled above the tree line, a delighted shiver rushed down my spine. I'd spent the past 4 years living along the coast and learning everything I could about the ocean that lined my family's winter residence in preparation for attendance at the lofty institution. Our family's abilities usually favored water, and most masters, including my father, believed that studying one's primary element was a crucial first step to mastering magic. "It's a noblewoman," someone whispered. A non-magical, probably, just out of sight. A few citizens, dressed in brown and red linen, paused in their work to watch us pass. We weren't in the capital city of Seolford properly yet, just Elfenfoss, the village on its outskirts. Few mages passed through the outer regions, except for long-distance travel. I curled my nostrils and tugged the curtain closed tighter. Everything smelled of dung and urine, and the road was pockmarked with holes and dips, conditions likely worsened by the recent earthquakes. My escort, Lord Algernon Mewarine, rode before me, his sable cloak shining in the midday sun. His stallion was lavishly decorated, its bridle and saddle scarlet and trimmed with gold. I sighed. Why couldn't I ride like that? There was so much outside to do and see. I thought of leaping from the carriage and darting through the haggard streets. Father said they were dangerous, but he thought everything was dangerous. Soon we left the village behind and approached the tall, glittering gates of Seolford. "It's Lord Algernon," one of the guards announced, promptly stepping aside. Almost home, I thought. Algernon suddenly looked over his shoulder, his green eyes narrowing as if we were being followed. The wind ruffled his fair hair, blowing strands over his high cheekbones and strong jaw. I gave him my brightest smile. "If you're uncomfortable, my lord, I could ride your stallion for the rest of the trip, and you could ride in the carriage," I said. "Lady Arabella, I shudder to think what may happen if I give you the reins to my horse," Lord Algernon said, as he continued riding. "Besides, Lord North-Hæven asked that I deliver you with your reputation unsullied." As if Algernon, infamous deflowerer of virgins, had any right to criticize another's reputation. Algernon's father Edward was the Marquis of Mewarine, and had he not been such fast friends and staunch allies with my own father Baldwin, the Baron of North-Hæven, Algernon might have cared far less about preserving my family's good name. "You steal someone's horse and gallop through the town one time," I muttered. "In your nightclothes, milady. When you were 10. Although Algernon's back was to me, I heard the smile in his voice. I sighed and settled behind the curtains again. Still. Algernon's voice came from the other side of the curtain. "I see those years of learning have done nothing to quell your impertinence." I grinned and smoothed out the locks of auburn hair which had escaped from my green hood. "Only the dim-witted call it impertinence," I quipped. Algernon snorted. It was something my father always said. A scientist and inventor himself, he raised me to be smart and bold. It was a strange occupation for a noble. I'd heard snickers at private parties that such manual labor was below his station, but it kept his mind and hands occupied, and his enthusiasm for his craft was contagious. My fondest memories were working with him beside the fire, handing him tools when he called for them, and taking off his glasses when he fell asleep at the desk again. "Well," Algernon said, "I'll confess I appreciate your company, as well as your wit, with the war weighing so heavily on my—" "War?" I tore aside the curtain, abandoning all appearance of propriety. Algernon cast me a reproachful look. "What war?" I asked. "I've heard of no such thing." "And how?" Sure, my family's winter residence was far from the kingdom of Resvere's shining capital, and gossip seldom reached there, but to not hear of a war raging, that was unthinkable. and my father had written nothing of it. I clenched my jaw. He was still determined to treat me as some little girl who needed to be sheltered and coddled. "The war is in another realm," Algernon said, sounding contemplative. "Much has changed since you left." I furrowed my brow as we came to a stop inside the wrought iron gates of my family's summer residence. Without waiting for any assistance, I dropped from the carriage, my green brocade skirts swishing around me. Algernon shook his head and dismounted his horse. When he offered his arm, I skipped past him. "I don't need an escort into my own house," I declared. "Besides, you wouldn't let me ride your horse." I'd practically been a prisoner for the last few days, and I needed to stretch my legs. I lifted my skirts and bolted up the steps, leaving him to follow, accompanied by the metallic ring of his armor. As I reached the door, a familiar figure opened it. Although Godfrey officially served as our family's butler, he was once a sword for hire and still knew how to throw a knife with the best of them. Not that anyone could tell by looking at his thin, pale form. We used to practice together at the edge of the property, flinging kitchen blades into stumps until the cook came out to scold us. I'd never seen Godfrey kill anyone, but most noble houses kept a few unsavory non-magicals, even spies and assassins around to do their dirty work for them. And although my father was an honest man, even he had to bend the rules sometimes for my protection. He was no fighter, but he always said the right information could be even more dangerous. I gave Godfrey a tight hug. He stiffened, frowning at me, but finally resolved to give me a quick pat on the head. He was cooler, more distant than usual. This was not the warm welcome I was expecting. "Welcome, Lady Arabella," Godfrey said. "Lord North-Hæven requests your presence in the East Parlor." "The East Parlor?" I asked, arching an eyebrow. "Does father have guests?" That would explain the cool welcome. "I imagine it's the Countess Rosewoodoo," Algernon said from behind me. I spun around and frowned. Algernon wouldn't meet my eyes and shifted uneasily on his feet, as if he'd been caught in a lie. "Countess Rosewoodoo?" The Rosewoodoo family emigrated to the city centuries before, but despite their magical prowess, they were one of the few mage families without a title. Until now, it seemed. Algernon nodded. "For her valor in the war efforts." Titles were not easily earned, which meant this was no small skirmish. I wondered at the fact that it had been one of the female Rosewoodoos that had earned her title, rather than one of the males. I shivered, wondering what kind of violence she must have inflicted to be awarded such a prestigious title. "We best not delay, milady," Godfrey said. Godfrey beckoned me onward. As I set a brisk pace to the parlor, my stomach lurched. Something is wrong, I thought. There's a war, and now whatever this is. I fidgeted with my hands as Godfrey announced my presence. When I entered the parlor, my father, silver-haired and gray-eyed, swept to my side. "Bella." Father pulled me into a bone-crushing embrace. "My girl, how you've grown." He looked older than I'd ever seen him, but his smile was genuine and I relaxed into his embrace. I grinned and kissed his cheek. "Miss me, Father? I think you're looking grayer without me." Father patted my hand and guided me to the sofa beside him. Gertrude Rosewoodoo and her son Clarence sat across from us, beneath the crystal chandeliers. But wait. Gertrude was the third-born of 5 children, so if she'd been named the Countess, what happened to her older sisters, Alienor and Gwenwyfar? My blood froze in my veins. When I scrutinized my father, his smile wavered. "Bella, you remember Lady Rosewoodoo, of course." He stressed the title for emphasis. I looked at Gertrude, whose lips rose into a kind, patient smile. A formidable mage and swordswoman, she was an uncommon blend of beauty and strength. She was tall and well-muscled, like some long-forgotten war goddess. But Gertrude's face was soft and framed by a froth of sleek chestnut curls. Her eyes, the only trait Gertrude shared with her willowy and fair-haired son, were dark like polished jet. They wasted no time in dressing for the title, I thought, noting the violet velvet ensemble they both wore. They might be the height of fashion this season, but I was out of touch. On Gertrude it looked stunning, but on Clarence looked a bit like a frumpy clown. "How could I forget?" I asked, giving a small curtsy. Why was Gertrude even here? Father should not have invited guests on my first day home and expected me to be polite, especially after half a day's travel. I was hot and uncomfortable. Father fidgeted with his gold wedding band, like he always did when he was nervous. "When I heard of your arrival, I invited Gertrude to come greet you. She brought you something," he said, "to commemorate your acceptance to the Studium Generale." "But why?" I asked. I barely knew her. "You will show respect to our guests," Father snapped at me. "I don't want your present," I replied coolly. "I want to know what's going on." My father drew in a sharp breath and audibly gulped. Clarence emitted a nervous laugh. Gertrude froze, a small golden box in her extended hand. "Father, what is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Whatever it was, I could tell by the pained expression on his face that it was bad. My skin crawled as I waited for him to continue. His hands flopped awkwardly, wiping his palms on his trousers. "Arabella, the Rosewoodoos have come to discuss the terms of your engagement." My jaw dropped. Surely I'd heard him wrong. "My engagement?" I exclaimed, crossing my arms. "Are you serious?" My father's face twisted into an expression of guilt, but quickly resolved into something stronger, a hard mask I barely recognized. He gave me a sharp nod of warning. We could discuss this later, but not right now. He was entreating me to watch my tongue, to stay calm. But how could I? This didn't make any sense. All the times my father and I discussed my future, he assured me that I could choose who I wanted to marry. Or not to marry at all. But this... What could have possibly occurred in my absence that would force this sudden engagement with a near stranger? All I knew about my betrothed was that he was quiet and boring. Clarence didn't have a mischievous or daring bone in his body. And if Clarence and I hated one another, it wasn't as if I could ever escape him. A divorce would destroy our family, and I realized with a cold rush of dread, Clarence outranked me now. I would be subservient to him for the rest of my life, and expected to be grateful with my lot. I reached for my neck, tugging at the stiff collar of my blouse. Father gave Gertrude an apologetic glance, as though I was being the unreasonable one, for being angry at my life falling to pieces before me. "Yes," he said, finally answering my question in the affirmative. He was serious, more serious than I'd ever seen him, and his eyes pleaded with me not to make a scene. I looked at Clarence, who offered a sheepish smile. Something like guilt flashed in his dark eyes. He wasn't surprised. Clarence had known. And Gertrude and my father knew. Even Algernon might have known. That would explain his weird behavior on the ride back. He was escorting me up the mountain to be slaughtered on the altar. I knew my family had some financial debt since my mother passed, but it couldn't be this bad. Heat rushed to my face. Was I literally the last person to know about this? Father flinched. Well, I'd not anticipated. "I barely even know him," I exclaimed, waving in Clarence's direction. "Bella!" Father's voice and face grew stern, and I could read the unspoken warning. I was acting entitled, and he was displeased. But I'd just arrived back home to find myself engaged, and the kingdom engaged in a war I hadn't heard the first word about. I squeezed my fingers into the folds of my dress tightly, then darted to the long table against the wall and grabbed a handful of chocolates. I couldn't say anything rude if my mouth was full, and chewing gave me time to think. "For you," Gertrude said, offering the box. As if a present could make all this more acceptable. I bristled. "I don't want it," I retorted, turning my shoulder to glare through the tall windows overlooking the gardens. A sudden sadness flashed in Gertrude's eyes. I pushed aside the twinge of guilt that I felt when her smile fell. Even if this was really happening, my father should have talked to me alone first and given me time to process. He had no right to walk me into an ambush. I had to know why. I couldn't just smile and agree with this madness. But maybe this was why he did it. He knew I'd argue and protest. By telling me this way, in front of my groom-to-be, he was saying this matter was absolutely beyond discussion. I turned towards the wall, blinking tears out of my eyes, fighting against the sting of betrayal. "Nevertheless," Gertrude said, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder, "I had this made specifically for you. It would be a shame if you refused it, regardless of whether or not you and Baldwin choose to break the engagement." I cringed as my father's name fell from her lips. Had they become so familiar in my absence to use each other's first names? But I didn't miss the emphasis in her words. There was still a choice. Maybe they needed my permission after all. Eyes narrowed, I took the box. This is a bribe, I thought. A pretty ring, probably. I opened the ornate box carefully, but it was no mere bauble. Instead, a red-brown wand, set with a sparkling blue sapphire, rested against the dark velvet. I forced back a squeak of excitement. My fingers caressed the wand, drawn instinctively to the pull of magic. "You must be careful using it," Father cautioned. "Magic is only safe if it's carefully controlled." All the masters said so, but with varying ideas of how dangerous untamed magic was. My fingers itched, and I fancied that I heard the hum of the wand's magic, drifting into my own veins and washing over me like a tide, wild and untamed. My eyes widened, reflecting the glowing pulse of the magical stone. "I'm sure Arabella is responsible enough for it," Gertrude said. I tore my eyes away from the wand to consider the offer. A pretty wand in return for my hand. Even if Gertrude said it was just a present, I knew it wasn't. A wand meant power and status. Few mages received their own until after their studies, and from the look in my father's eyes, this hadn't been his idea. I met Clarence's dark eyes and wondered if he was as eager to escape this mess as I was. Probably. But then I recognized the gesture as something else, a promise of unity between his house and mine. An alliance with Clarence meant a relationship with his beautiful and powerful mother. A mage so gifted she'd earned a title through blood and violence. She could teach me so many things. Marrying her son was just the bargaining price. My lip trembled, as their eyes practically pinned me against the wall. I could no longer bear to be in the same room with them, waiting for answers. I took a deep breath and squared my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I acted like a proper lady of my station instead of the wild girl I'd always been. "Thank you both for your visit, and for the gift," I bowed. "I appreciate your offer and will contemplate your proposal. Now please excuse me, for I am fatigued and famished from my travels. I hope we can meet again soon once my father and I have deliberated." After Godfrey escorted Gertrude and Clarence from the parlor, I darted to my feet. My father ran a hand through his gray hair and leaned forward, curling in on himself. "I know you're angry," he said, "but I must look after your interests." "My interests?" I asked, flailing my arms. I felt like a kettle set to boil. "How is forcing me into a marriage looking after me? I don't even know Clarence. They haven't even been noble for that long. And you didn't tell me there was a war going on." My father sighed. "Bells," he said, softening his voice. "You're only 18. It isn't your place to worry." "But it is. I should know if there's a threat to our kingdom, and you should have told me that you were planning my marriage. You sent me away for my education, but it was actually so you could plot behind my back and decide my future." To a powerful, magical family with a great deal of wealth and a good reputation. I've already asked the other council members for their opinions on the Rosewoodoo pedigree, and the masters agree our families are nicely matched. As if that was all that mattered. Wealth, reputation, and pedigree. No one cared about things like compatibility. "I won't do it," I said. I'd sooner marry a dead fish. Do you think I would give you to someone I don't trust? Father asked, sounding weary. My darling, I know you're unhappy, but this is a good match. Besides, I didn't know your mother when she and I wed, but we became fond of one another quickly. I flinched when he mentioned mother. I could barely remember her, but I knew from portraits I strongly resembled her. We both had the same fiery auburn curls and the same frost blue eyes. Even our smiles were alike. I wondered sometimes if looking at me hurt my poor father. How many times had he said, I needed a woman's hand in my raising? I'd grown up like a feral wolf until he'd sent me away for school. Despite my determination to be angry, I felt my fury abate, like ice melting in the sunlight. I crossed over to the couch finally and sat beside him, facing the fireplace. He loosened his tie and put his feet up on the table. The room looked sparser than I remembered, and I noticed a few of our family heirlooms, and pieces of furniture were missing. Were we really so hard up that Father had begun selling our possessions? I took a deep breath and sighed. And if I never love him? I asked. You take lovers and practice discretion, Father said gently, like the centuries of nobility before you. And if you're clever, you'll hire a good apothecary, who is skilled in brewing contraceptives and abortifacients for you. I see, I responded, rolling my eyes. Despite the dark humor in his eyes, I wasn't entirely sure my father was joking, and my cheeks began to warm as I realized we were dangerously near a frank conversation about my sex life. Bells, he said, taking my hand. I need you to marry Clarence, for your own good and for the good of this family. Before it's too late. I furrowed my brow. Are we in some sort of trouble? When he didn't answer for a half-second too long, I sucked in a wavering breath. It's something I'll handle, Father said. But for now, promise you'll at least entertain the idea of Clarence Rosewoodoo. My father's eyes softened with desperation, and because I couldn't think of an escape, I gave him a small, encouraging smile. I will promise to think about it. He wrapped me into a hug, his relief palpable. The scent of his cologne, rosemary and peppermint, flooded my nostrils. I let myself relax against him, finally feeling like I belonged in the house I grew up in. Then, he patted my back and reached behind him, retrieving the abandoned box and its wand. The gift is very generous, my father said. If Gertrude herself designed this wand, you can be sure it will serve you well. I'm sure, I murmured, tearing my gaze away from the sparkling stone. Something about it was seductive and dangerous. I could feel my fingers yearning to reach for it without conscious effort. Instead, I closed the box firmly and hooked the golden latches shut. I have some legislation I need to read over. I'll see you in the morning, Father said. He patted my shoulder once more, and I started, realizing the sun had set and it was already dusk outside. I stared after him, hoping he might turn around and join me for dinner. He'd barely asked me anything about my adventures and travels, and I had so much to tell him. Through the garden windows, I could see a smattering of stars against the deepening purple sky. With a sigh, I took the box and the wand in hand and retreated to my bedroom upstairs. I smiled wistfully at the pink and gold trim and the pile of dolls on the bed. This was the room of a young girl, and I'd returned to it a surprised bride. I pushed the dolls off the bed and kicked them under the mattress. Then I sat in the dark, letting exhaustion take me. I drifted into an uneasy sleep, and when I woke again, it was late and dark. Hearing whispers, I jolted awake, but there was no one there except the box. I could see the gleam of blue light, even though the box was shut. I lifted the latch with trembling fingers, letting the glow of the light wash over me, illuminating my room like a bright blue candle. I took the wand in my hand and lifted it up, waving it with a flourish until I felt foolish. What can you do? I asked. For a moment, The sapphire seemed to glow brighter in response. Then a thin, glittering mist swirled from around the wand's tip. With a grin, I spun around. Droplets of water formed in the air and hung suspended like tiny, glistening jewels for a heartbeat. Then, they fell on me, the cold water sinking into my hair and through the fabric of my dress. It smelled like the ocean, and for a moment it was like I was rolling with the waves, becoming one with the tide. My heart beat as I realized I'd made it rain indoors, without even trying. What was happening to me? Instinctive magic was the most dangerous kind. I'd known that since I was a little girl, but the power from the wand seemed to caress against my skin, as gentle as a lover's embrace, and my heart ached to sink into it. I turned the wand over in my hands. I could sabotage my engagement with Clarence, I thought. But how much trouble was our family in? What unspoken danger had made my father so nervous? Why want to align our family and heritage with the brutal and cunning Rosewoodoos? Soon, I'd finally begin training at the Academy of Mages. I'd been waiting years for this, and my first day would no doubt be shadowed by rumors of my engagement. I was already nothing more than a bride-to-be, my future, which this morning had felt open and exhilarating, now felt stiff and constricted. As I put the wand away and closed it tightly, a sharp edge of metal sliced my finger, drawing blood. I scowled at the box, carefully feeling for the sharp edge. My eyes widened when it slid to the side, revealing a secret panel and a tiny scrap of parchment. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. I knew it meant relationships chosen could be stronger than those we were born into. It was an old saying, but it rang with a certain resonance as I whispered it to myself in the darkness, like a promise on my lips. Chapter 2. The Studium Generale was divided into 4 guilds, corresponding with the 4 elements: fire, water, wind, and earth. Historically, the North-Hæven family was almost exclusively placed in the Water Guild, which was the excuse my father gave for sending me to the sea. Fledgling mages could choose a different discipline if it called to them, but most first years went along with tradition. Part of me wondered how much of a mage's discipline was natural ability, and how much was training and study. But I didn't question or resent my guild, other than a passing curiosity about the system, and after spending years by the seaside, I felt a kinship with my element. As I settled at the long wood table, I reached into the deep pockets of my cloak to fondle the polished oak of my wand. Gertrude's present. Using the Countess's gift felt like a pledge, a commitment, but father hadn't offered me another wand, and it was better than the basic practice wands offered to first-year students with a pedigree. Movement flickered in the corner of my eye, and my muscles tensed as Clarence sat beside me. There were 20 seats in this room, and so far only half of them were filled, and Clarence had to sit next to me. It was bad enough Clarence and I were engaged without my consent, but now I couldn't even avoid him during my classes. Why couldn't he forge an alliance with someone else? Even though a week had passed since my surprise engagement, I still hadn't forgiven anyone for it. I'd been distracted with preparations to start school, but now on the first day of lectures, butterflies flittered in my stomach. I wanted a life filled with my own accomplishments, not to be defined by the circumstances of my birth or betrothal. Maybe the wedding wouldn't need to happen soon. Maybe at least I'd have the chance to prove myself first. "Hello?" Clarence said quietly. I nodded curtly, and although I didn't look at Clarence, I sensed him watching me. "I'm sorry about all this, Arabella. If it's any consolation, I promise I won't interfere. I'll leave you to your own devices and affairs. It can be a marriage of convenience, in name only, if that appeals to you." A marriage of convenience? How romantic. I wasn't expecting him to sweep me off my feet, but he could have at least tried to woo me. "If you're trying to talk me into it, you're off to a bad start." "I'm not. I just wanted you to know that even though the situation isn't ideal, I'll do my best to be a husband you're proud of." "So you've already resigned yourself to this?" I said, turning to consider him fully for the first time. Of course he had. Clarence didn't have a rebellious bone in his body. I'm not eager to be married either, but it's important to my mother. With Auntie Allier and Auntie Gwen dead, mother has new warriors, and I won't add to them. His melancholy stole the anger from my expression. I'd considered the Rosewoodoo family as ambitious upstarts, eager to solidify their new title by marrying into a more established lineage, but something told me there was more to the story, and the fact that he didn't want to marry me nipped at my pride annoyingly. What happened to them? I asked, curiosity getting the best of me. They died, Clarency said thickly, fighting in the war. Uncle Edmund and Auntie Dory are fighting too. They've been gone for a few months now, and mother only just returned from battle. Guilt coiled in my belly. My father was my only family left. I'd be terrified if he was off fighting in some mage battle. I couldn't even imagine how difficult it must be having an entire family at risk. Reluctantly, I looked at him, and when I found his gaze focused on the master's desk at the front of the room, I took the opportunity to study his features. Although I'd seen Clarence at balls and celebrations, I'd never really considered him. His skin was so pale, he looked as if he'd been carved from ice. His face bore high cheekbones, a thin nose, and a slender jawline. No one would ever call him handsome, but he was certainly pretty. How had Gertrude Rosewoodoo sired such a delicate creature? I worried the whole time that mother might never return, Clarence murmured with a faraway expression. I was so distraught I barely slept. What are we even fighting over? I asked. Do you know? Clarence shrugged. I honestly have no idea. Mother won't tell me. I've tried asking the staff, but everyone seems to be keeping secrets these days. I don't even know where the fighting is located or how far away it is. How can we be fighting a war without knowing who we're fighting or where? I asked. I don't know, Clarence replied, but I've seen the bodies, those that make it back. Whatever it is, the threat is real. The kingdom's army is so overburdened. I've heard that even some of the older students are being sent to the front. That can't be right, I said, my skin prickling. The curriculum at the Academy of Mages had always been strictly separate from affairs of the state. Battle magic was seen as a lower form of practice. Anger, rage, and emotion were the antithesis of proper concentration and control, signs of a restless spirit, to be eradicated with study and practice. Magic was dangerous and could cause grievous harm, which is why conflict and violence needed to be avoided at all costs. We were in one of the older buildings on campus, and I let my eyes sweep across the bookshelves, glass beakers, and varied pieces of musty taxidermy that adorned the stone walls. Nobody is attacking us here, or we'd be able to hear or see signs of the battle, and if the fighting is taking place far away, why would the Kingdom of Resverie devote so much of its resources waging it, or keep it a secret? Mother says it's for our own protection, Clarence added. The war is going well, but secrecy is crucial to our final victory. She tells me to be patient, and that all things will be resolved soon, one way or another. The war against whom? I wondered. The ominous tone in his voice set me on edge, but we were distracted as the teacher entered, sweeping gracefully into the room. He was a tall man with red hair and blue eyes, magnified by the thick lenses of his bronze-wired glasses. Good morning, class. I am Master Roderick Brookshire, and I will be your mentor throughout your studies. He frowned at a list of topics that had been written in chalk on the board at the front of the classroom. I'd already familiarized myself with the first-year materials, and my satchel was heavy with books I'd found in my father's library. Most of them I'd read years ago, and I'd been warned that the first few years of study would be spent on study and discipline, rather than practical application. So I was surprised when Master Brookshire crossed out the entire list, before erasing the board and dusting the chalk off his dark suit. Because of the ongoing war efforts, he announced, the Studium Generale has agreed to alter our curriculum to suit the needs of the kingdom. As such, we will be accelerating our usual course of study. This works not only to the kingdom's benefit, but also to yours. Because of the enhanced speed of this program, we'll be able to train you as mages in a fraction of the time. Fast magic is sloppy magic, I repeated under my breath, citing the maxim I'd heard my father repeat dozens of times whenever I'd tried to perform spellwork at home. The last time before I was sent away, I'd lit my sheets on fire trying to coax my bed into making itself. I've always been taught that magic requires patience and discipline, Clarence asked, echoing my thoughts. Won't this be dangerous? The whine in his voice emboldened me. Despite my misgivings, I wasn't afraid of a little danger, if it meant we'd be getting to actually employ magic more quickly. Brookshire's smile was indulgent. The Academy has always focused on theoretical applications of magic, and it's true, when delving into the unknown mysteries of the universe and formulating new hypotheses about the structure of reality that must be vigorously tested, some danger is to be expected, which is why in past years we've made sure to train young mages more thoroughly. However, provided one is familiar with a handful of protective rituals and spells, and sticking with only the most tried and tested enchantments, even a rudimentary knowledge with the basics can be quite effective. After all, he said, speaking as if we were small children, you don't need to understand how fire works for it to burn you. Once you've learned the proper positions, charms, and movements, you should progress quickly. So you'll be teaching us how to burn the enemies of Resveri? Asked a student behind me, with a dark chuckle. I thought this was the Water Guild. I recognized the voice as Alfred's, the handsome and quick-witted bastard son of the Duke of Eastlawn and the Baroness of Wellobrucken. Alfred was a gentleman adventurer who'd been all over the continent and always returned with fantastic stories. When I was a little girl, I'd had daydreams about him being my knight in shining armor. A delighted shiver shot through me when our eyes connected, and his lips curved up into a smirk. I turned back to find Clarence watching me thoughtfully, and my cheeks burned red. A smattering of nervous laughter filled the room, which Master Brookshire cut off by clearing his throat. Through careful guidance and practice, Brookshire said with a gleam in his eyes, you will discover that water, properly wielded, is far more dangerous than fire, or indeed any of the other disciplines. The Council of Mages has carefully considered and approved the course plan, and despite my personal misgivings, we will proceed accordingly. Wait, what exactly will you be asking us to do? Asked a timid voice from the back of the room. I recognized it as Audrey, a dark-haired girl I used to climb trees with when we were little. Should I have brought a swimming suit or rain jacket? Will it hurt? Not unless you're careless, Brookshire said dismissively. Why don't we begin with a demonstration? He drew a wand from the wide sleeves of his robes and chanted under his breath, before spinning quickly on his feet. Then, he cast his arm upwards in a sharp, sudden motion. Droplets of water materialized before him, held suspended in the air for a handful of seconds before falling to the ground. My heartbeat quickened. I'd done the same with my wand, though on accident. As you can see, there is often enough ambient moisture in the atmosphere to draw water out of thin air, as it were. Although, of course, it's much faster to get liquid from another source. Brookshire shifted his position and went up onto one leg, taking a deep breath, before reaching out for the mug of black tea on his desk. He sipped it slowly, standing on one leg, and I stifled a laugh at the strange demonstration. Then, so quickly I nearly missed it, he flicked his wrist and tossed the steaming liquid towards us in wide arch. The class erupted in squeals and gasps, but before the liquid reached us, the professor had manipulated his figure through a burst of precise steps and movements, calling the water back to him. It coiled around him like a serpent, before coming together in an orb above his raised hand. Then, with a softly whispered command, the liquid changed shape into a short dagger and froze into solid ice. Brookshire flung the ceramic mug towards the door with one hand, and then lashed out with the icicle. It split the mug into pieces before impaling into the wooden door with a thud. The classroom broke into applause. Water is the most complicated of all the elements, particularly within the field of wandmanship. My colleagues who study sigils talk highly of the effort and practice required to make all those little symbols work, and yet within sigils, you can create ice in a single step, provided you draw the sigil properly. Do that, and you've done it. But with wandmanship, you're always working from water, and it takes intense focus to freeze the element, particularly as you cast it. The formation of ice, along with teleportation, will be your primary focus this semester, as both will be the most useful in battle and dueling. Teleportation? I wondered, my eyes widening. That was advanced magic. Why would we need to learn it in our first year? I rubbed my thumb over the sapphire in my wand and imagined frost creeping from its tip. Blood hummed in my ears, and a coolness swept over me. Magic whirled just at the edge of my senses and murmured to me, coaxing me to sink deeper into it. When working to create ice, Brookshire continued, staring right at me, you may feel the temptation to follow your instincts rather than your careful training, but you must remember that the best approach for mastering magic is having a firm control on your element. You must not let yourself be seduced by the power you seek to wield. Instead, you must bend and break the forces of nature themselves to your will. My head buzzed. There were hisses at the edge of my hearing, followed by a flash of something like icy disapproval. I frowned and looked at my wand. I'm supposed to ignore my instincts, I thought. But sinking into my powers and feeling the force of my element had felt so easy, so right. This was going to be harder than I thought. One thing about mastering water became quickly apparent. It involved getting wet a lot. After the first few days of classes, all my classmates and I managed to do was make it rain all over ourselves and the classroom. Audrey brought a poncho on the third day, and half of my classmates grudgingly followed suit. I stubbornly left class each day, drenched from head to toe, my skirts dripping through the marble corridors of the campus. A common beginner's mistake, Brookshire said sagely, as if that would make any of us feel better when we trudged, soaking wet, to the line of horses and carriages waiting for us at the gates after class. Only Alfred had managed to create ice, delicate tendrils of frost that swept over the ground, and because of his success, he'd been immediately moved to a more advanced class, leaving the rest of us even more frustrated. I bet I could create ice too, I thought, if I went with my instincts. At first, I pushed the thought out of my mind, as I'd done 100 times before. Everything I knew about magic confirmed that instinctive magic was dangerous. I'd never realized just how tempting it was, but that's because I'd never actually tried to use it before. Now, anxious that I was falling behind in class, the brooding war on the horizon, and my father's secret private fears that kept him locked away in his study nearly every hour of every day, made me determined to master magic at any cost. After all, isn't this what the Academy was pressing us to do? A shortcut to magical ability, without the rigorous training and study? Why shouldn't I do what came more easily to me, if it produced results? And who would know? Nobody could see into the private musings of the human heart, my personal thoughts and feelings. A fleeting suspicion quickened my pulse. Who's to say that wasn't what Alfred had already done? I bit the inside of my cheek and considered my options as the stable boy brought my horse, a fine, chestnut palfrey, to me. My skin warmed when I thought of how I'd made water materialize in my room. I'd had such a finesse and ease with it, and I hadn't entirely soaked myself in the process. The fact of the matter was that I was better with instinctive magic, and if I practiced with it, I might become even more advanced. People said it was evil, that it couldn't be trusted, but that was mostly superstition. It wasn't like magic was animate, with a will and mind of its own. Water was no more evil than air, fire, or wind. It could provide warmth, health, and growth, or destruction, pain, and chaos. It all depended on the mage directing its path. And I certainly wasn't evil. A desperate plan took shape in my mind. I couldn't practice instinctive magic at school or at home, not where anyone might guess what I was doing. But the village was another matter entirely. It couldn't be too difficult to pay off some non-magicals and have them ignore my efforts. I set a quick pace through the streets of Seolford, putting as much distance between the Studium Generale as I could. Father would spend the day in the council chambers, so it would be a while before he learned I hadn't gone directly home. And I'd always been prone to running off. Never to the village, but what he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. When I returned, I'd just tell him I'd gone to the shopping district or something more appropriate. No one stopped me at the city gates. I passed between the tall iron spikes, lined with uniformed guards. While non-magicals weren't allowed in Seolford, mages could always go wherever they pleased. My fine clothes and horse were sure to draw attention, but no one would recognize me, and the village was sure to have a stable somewhere. Alfred would probably come here with me if I asked him to. He'd always been good for an adventure, unlike boring Clarence. But I'd barely seen him since he'd earned a place in a more advanced class by producing ice. Jealousy and loneliness fought for ascendance in my chest, squeezing my heart like a thorn bush, but I pushed them aside. Seolford rested atop of massive hill, overlooking Elfenfoss, but I'd only ever seen the path connecting them through slivers between the silken curtains of my carriage. Now, with the open landscape spread out before me, the world seemed massive. Behind me, the crystal spires of the Studium Generale stretched above Seolford's walls, and down below the multicolored rooftops of the village unfolded like an exotic tapestry. I straightened my back and smiled benevolently as I entered the village. A shiver of exhilaration bolted through my spine. While father was laxer than most parents in Seolford, he'd have never agreed to let me travel here without an escort. As I entered deeper between the settlements, the road grew muddier and more uneven. Spider cracks spread across the clay road, no doubt from the earthquakes, which began during my girlhood and had yet to cease. The houses were small things, made of cobbled-together stone walls and thatched roofs. Already I'd drawn a few stairs. The villagers parted around me, ducking into doorways or around corners, like a school of fish hiding from a predator. I turned off the main road, until I came to a quieter path on the edge of town. A non-magical walked along the side of the road carrying a basket. She was young, maybe 20 at most. Long, fiery red curls tumbled over her shoulder, unrestrained by a hood or net. Her skin was tanned from the sun and dotted with freckles. "Excuse me," I called. "You there." She paused, irritation flaring in her green eyes. It was as if she was insulted I'd addressed her. "I'm seeking a stable," I said. "Where may I find one?" The girl arched an eyebrow. "Look, princess." "I'm not a princess," I corrected quickly. Her lips curled into a sneer. "Clearly you're not very bright either. You don't even recognize when you're being insulted." I stared at her as the words slowly sank in. I'd never been insulted before, and certainly not by a non-magical. "You don't need to be so unkind," I replied. "What is your name?" She crossed her arms. "Why? Are you going to complain to Daddy?" Heat rushed to my face. "Where I come from, it's good manners to know the name of your inferiors." The girl's face twisted into an edged smile. "Frank?" she said. "Hilarious," I deadpanned. "Would you believe it's Jack?" "Jackass, maybe," I retorted. She laughed and jabbed a finger further down the road. "That way, princess." I wondered if there really was a stable straight ahead, or if she was just trying to rid herself of me. "Thank you, peasant," I said stiffly. "You've been most gracious." "Why are you wandering through town all alone, anyway?" she asked suspiciously. I weighed my options, trying to decide how much I ought to tell this girl. She was a stranger, true, but at least she seemed willing to talk to me. Finally, I reached beneath my skirts, hitching them up over my legs. The girl's eyes flickered briefly to my exposed thighs as I drew the wand from my boot. She pulled away reflexively, as if I'd pulled a knife on her. At least she was smart enough to be wary of mages. I grinned darkly. Even though I had no idea how to use the wand, it felt good to have someone think that I did. I imagined myself an imposing mage, a sight to behold, like Gertrude. "I want to practice with this," I said, "without being seen. I need some place where no one will recognize me." The girl's expression changed. some of her frostiness thawing and making way for something warm and shrewd. "And I suppose," she said, "you'll be buying someone's secrecy, or compensation for using the space, at least." My heartbeat quickened. "I suppose," I conceded. The girl rocked back on her heels. "I might be persuaded to help you with that." "After you've been so rude to me?" I asked, putting the wand away. "Look," she said, "I don't think it really matters how I feel. Your money is good and I could use it. My grandpa owns an inn. If you can do your magic stuff inside, it shouldn't be a problem to rent you a room for a bit." I frowned, considering the offer. That sounded perfect, actually. An enclosed area where I wouldn't be disturbed, and clearly, this girl understood the importance of secrecy. A tiny thrill burst inside me when I thought of secretly slipping away to practice my magic in a non-magical's inn. Father would have a heart attack if he knew, but I was entitled to a bit of rebellion. After he engaged me to Clarence without speaking to me first, this could be my last adventure. I nodded curtly. "Show me." "Follow me," she waved, quickening her pace. I coaxed my horse into a trot as the girl walked briskly through town. Even then, I couldn't help but let my eyes drift over everything before me. There were so many people stomping undeterred through the muddy streets. Everything seemed so colorless here. The non-magicals could only afford to dye their clothing red, brown, or gray, and the contrast between them and the colorfully garbed mages was stark. I felt suddenly self-conscious in my turquoise gown, which stood out like an emerald among a briar patch. "You look like you've never seen the town before." "I haven't," I replied honestly. "Not like this. It's incredible." She snorted. "Right. Anyway, if you're going to come often, we can keep a room ready for you. We'll put your name on it." "Make up a name," I said. "Sure," she agreed. A smile teased her lips, and I rolled my eyes, wondering what kind of imbecilic name she'd assigned to me. We arrived before a small building. The word "inn" was painted on a roughly hewn sign, which dangled from bits of twine tied to the railing. A slight barefoot boy ran to my horse and grasped her bridle. I dismounted, adjusting my skirts. "That's Chauncey," the girl informed me. "He'll take good care of your horse." "And who are you?" I asked. "If I'm staying with you, I ought to know." "I told you, Jack. It's short for Jacqueline." "Jacqueline," I said. "Arabella." I cursed myself a moment later for revealing my real name. I was really no good at this clandestine business. Jacqueline saw the hesitation in my eyes and grabbed my hand, pulling me inside suddenly. She reached around me to close the door behind us, her hand skimming past the ruffles of my dress. "Don't worry, Princess," she whispered in the cramped entrance. "I'll tell my grandpa you're the daughter of a foreign merchant. We'll call you Rebecca, though I might call you Rabbit in private, just for fun. You'll pay double the weekly rate for your privacy, and I'll keep the prying neighbors at bay with fancy stories. I'm real good at spinning yarn. Deal?" I only hesitated for another moment before nodding. Jacqueline had all the cards, and she knew it. "Then let me show you to your room." Chapter 3. I returned to Seolford with my father none the wiser, and the following week fell into the same pattern. After attending classes, I sneaked over to Jack's inn and practiced sinking deeper into my power. Sometimes I stayed for dinner, which was usually dry bread and a weak soup, unless Jack brought home a wild hare or crow, which we roasted outside on a makeshift grill over hot coals. Her grandfather was unwell, though they wouldn't talk about it. Some nights we'd play cards by candlelight. Their mangy, nameless cat, a ball of gray fur, seemed to prefer the satined folds of my lap more than any other perch in the inn. Most of the time, I spent in my rented room, counting the cracks in the ceiling until the light faded. It was sparse, with just a bed, a basin for washing, a pewter candle stand, and a small vanity mirror I suspected the procured just for me. Some days I just read or took naps. Father always told me the secret to control was to sit patiently and look within. but I found stewing in my own company frightfully boring. My mind flitted to Jack, so defiant and bold, and my heart gave an anxious little flutter. No one had ever spoken to me quite like Jack had, and I couldn't keep from returning to her in my mind. I wondered if this is what it felt like to have a friend, or maybe accomplice was a better word, bound together by danger and secrecy. When the weekend came, Father was home. And then, I realized it was all too easy. How had my overprotective father not noticed my absence for so long? What was occupying my father's time? I'd been so busy with my own secret project, I hadn't been paying enough attention to his. I knocked timidly on the door, on the pretense of bringing him brunch, and my eyes widened at the disarray of his office. Papers and diagrams obscured the floor, and the fine wooden furniture had been pushed against the walls to clear more space. Bronze gears and measuring tools littered the floor, and amid the mess, my father sat, waving his wand over the symbols of the device before him. It was a round creation, lined with sigils and sparkling gems. How had I not noticed this mess? I started to collect papers, organizing them into a pile. "Leave them," Father snapped. "Everything is in exactly the right place. You'll just mess them up again." I tilted my head and approached slowly, gingerly picking my way across the chaos. "What is this?" I asked, studying the diagrams. My father's head snapped up. His gray eyes were bloodshot. "Get out," he said, waving me away. I paused, an ache forming in my chest. "Get out?" I asked doubtfully. He'd never asked me to leave before. "Please, Arabella," he said. "I need to focus." "Maybe I can help," I added. "Like I did when I was little." "Do you honestly think you were helping even back then? You were always getting underfoot and making a nuisance of yourself. Letting you help was the only way to get you to sit still." What was going on with him? A sweet smell drew my attention to a nearly empty bottle of purple liquid on the carpet next to him. A flash of guilt crossed his face as he swept it quickly under the desk. Then he laughed bitterly and ran his hands through his hair, so it stuck out from all directions. "You can help by spending time with your betrothed. You've been neglecting him." "I haven't," I lied. "If it appears that way, it's because Clarence has not sought me out." My father furrowed his brow, looking so tired and frustrated that a sharp sting of guilt curled in my belly. "You're not a little girl anymore, Arabella North-Hæven," my father said slowly. "If you haven't learned by now to take care of your own responsibilities without a parent nagging you, I suppose it's too late for you, maybe too late for us both." I set the food on the desk carefully, my eyes watering from the condescension in his voice. Worse than that, the apathy, as if he could no longer be bothered to care about me at all. "Whatever it is, it's going to be great," I said softly, trying to make amends. "You're the most brilliant inventor on the council." "Yes, and look where it's gotten me," he said darkly, chuckling at his own joke. "The truth is, brilliance can be its own punishment, more than any reward." I averted my gaze to the diagrams at my feet, wishing I could understand the mechanics of whatever he was working on. I wanted him to ask about at school, but wasn't sure how to broach the subject without revealing more than I cared to about my secret practice in the village. Previously, I'd dreamed of showing off my progress and impressing him, but I still couldn't even make ice. "Sometimes," I whispered, near the door, "I tell the wand to do things for me, and it does." His head snapped up at this, studying me. I met his gaze, and he didn't look angry, just tired, as if something had sapped all energy from him. Then he turned around again, digging through his papers. "Despite what Roderick may say, most young mages have a phase where they use instinctive magic. But you need to at least pretend to keep up with the work." The parlor maid halted a couple of feet behind me and bowed, interrupting our conversation. "My lord, Lady Rosewoodoo and Lady Dorothea are here to see you." "Send them in," my father said, I grimaced as the parlor maid went to fulfill Father's orders. I didn't know Dory was back yet, Father mused. Dory must be the youngest Rosewoodoo sister. I raised my eyebrows, surprised that my father was already on such familiar terms with our soon-to-be in-laws. I sighed and shifted on my feet, lingering behind the door as the two women entered. When she saw me, Gertrude smiled so brilliantly that I couldn't prevent the small, upward twitch of my lips. "Arabella, how are you finding the wand?" she asked. "It works excellently," I said. "I'm glad to hear it," she said. "It's very powerful. I chose it specifically for you. Though it can be stubborn, I'm confident you will master it in time." How could a wand be stubborn? Gertrude raised her arms, clearly going for a hug. I glanced at my father, and seeing his lined face, I returned her embrace. The finely woven silk of Gertrude's gown brushed against my cheek. She smelled of roses. I wanted to ask her about the note, or the wand. Maybe there was a secret to unlocking its powers I hadn't considered. After she released me, I smiled at Dorothea, who stood quietly nearby. Dorothea was the rare fire mage in the water-dominated Rosewoodoo family, skilled at crafting and manipulating lightning. It was a gift she'd inherited from her father Edric, who, according to gossip, died from his wife's poorly made aphrodisiac. Dorothea shared Gertrude's brown hair and dark eyes, but unlike her sister, she was a tiny, spindly creature. Rather like Clarence, actually. And while Gertrude was luminous, her cheeks reddened with spots of carefully applied rogue, Dorothea's wild hair and bruised jawline made her look as though she'd crawled from the wild forests that were south of Seolford. "You must be Clarence's intended," Dorothea mused. "A pleasure." "Same," I replied, with a flash of guilt. I'd believed everything I'd ever heard about the Rosewoodoo family, even spreading malicious rumors myself, without ever actually speaking to any of them. "It's a pity we're only going to be around for a few more days," Gertrude said. "Or you could spend more time getting to know each other." I blushed, wondering if Gertrude was capable of reading my unvoiced thoughts. Such abilities were rare among mages, but not impossible. "You're leaving already?" I asked, genuinely disappointed. "Back to the front lines," Dorothea said, with a determined gleam in her eyes. "But we'll avenge Edmund, if nothing else," Gertrude murmured. Edmund was the only Rosewoodoo boy, Clarence's uncle. What happened to him? I wanted to ask more about the war, but the questions died on my lips as my father cleared his throat loudly and held the door open to me. "If you wouldn't mind," Father said with a cough, eyeing me. "We've pressing matters to discuss." "Clarence is waiting in the parlor," Gertrude said. "He expressed an interest in seeing the gardens if you'd be willing to indulge him." I understood a dismissal when I heard one, but I looked pleadingly towards my father. I hated to be shut out of important discussions for something as banal as studying the flora around our estate. He jerked his head sharply to the door. I forced a smile and curtsied. Then, my face still burning from my father's sharp words, I lifted my skirts and went into the parlor. Clarence sat on the sofa, his hands clasped in his lap. His light blue suit made him look even paler than usual as he gazed towards the windows. "Clarence," I said. He started as if I'd struck him. With a sigh, I dropped onto the love seat beside him. "I'm sorry about your uncle," I said quietly. Clarence's face pinched with worry. He might still survive. Then he isn't dead yet, I thought, with a sigh of relief. "I'm glad. I trailed off. I thought of saying that I understood. I'd lost my mother, after all, but it wasn't the same. I'd never really known her. Instead, I tried to change the subject. "How is class? For you?" I asked awkwardly. Even though we took most of the same subjects, we hadn't really talked since that first day at the academy. I supposed both of us were eager to prove our worth quickly, and the rigorous wartime curriculum left little time for social considerations. "It's quiet these days," Clarence replied, "with Alfred gone. And I've heard Audrey will be leaving soon as well. Leaving to where? I asked. Clarence furrowed his brow. To war, I imagine, he said. Mind you, I'm just repeating gossip, but… I thought they were just moved to more advanced classes, I said, dread slowly creeping into my body. I hope so, Clarence sighed. But have you seen him since Brookshire announced he was moved? I haven't. With a cold stab of fear, I realized I hadn't either. I sprang to my feet and curled my hands into fists. But they're just children, I yelled. They barely managed to make ice, so now they're shipped off suddenly to die in some mysterious war against some faceless foe. I'm so tired of not being told anything, I snapped. We all are, Clarence replied softly. But you know more than me, I pointed out, eyeing him shrewdly. When I was away, Father didn't even tell me that there was a war, and he didn't tell me about my engagement. Now, he's working on this thing with your mother and aunt, I guess. It's like he's obsessed. What is it, Clarence? What are they working on? I bent down and grabbed his arms, as if I could pry the truth out of him. Clarence shook his head, but his eyes met mine for the first time. I honestly don't know, he said. I've asked my mother, but she refuses to tell me anything. I paced across the rug, Clarence's eyes following my movements. My gut said that this was all connected somehow. The war, my engagement, and this device. But how? What if it's a weapon? I asked breathlessly. But then why would he be building it at home? And what happens when he finishes it? Whatever it is, I'm going to figure it out. A strange, fiery brilliance came to Clarence's dark eyes. I'd always considered them flat and lifeless, but under the light of the window they had surprising depth. They were full of uncertainty, and something else, something darker. They reminded me of swirling storm clouds just before lightning strikes. We are going to figure this out, Clarence amended. We? I asked, turning towards him. Determination flashed in his eyes, and he lifted his chin with resolve. I can't lose anyone else, he said, his voice thick. I've already lost most of my family to this war. I deserve to know why. Even though I'd been engaged to Clarence for 2 weeks and had known of him nearly my entire life, I felt as though I was seeing him now for the first time. He didn't look strong, but his slender form seemed nevertheless to radiate a quiet reliance, like a pliant spring bough that, bent too far, snaps back with surprising ferocity. After class Monday, I followed him from the gates of the academy. It was a windy day, and pink petals from the dogwood trees that flanked the main avenue carpeted the dark pavement. Clarence looked taken aback at first, to find me walking beside him, but then offered his arm to escort me. We'd yet to confirm our engagement publicly, and truthfully, I'd been dreading the inevitable rumors, but found myself strangely indifferent, even a little grateful. Questioning voices would be easily silenced by the news. There was nothing abnormal or dissolute in taking an afternoon stroll with my intended. So, I asked quietly, once we'd left behind the rabble erupting from the academy grounds. Where should we start? We're going to the infirmary, Clarence said, his voice low as we walked. Maybe we can talk to someone who has been in the war, who can tell us what they've seen. Smart, I conceded, earning a rare smile from him. But will they let us in? Clarence hesitated. Yes, at least I'm confident they'll let me in. His Uncle Edmund must be there, I realized suddenly. I brushed my cheek against Clarence's shoulder and gazed at him through my eyelashes. I'll be fine, he said, forcing a smile. The infirmary was officially part of the Studium Generale, but several blocks away from campus, surrounded by sculpted fountains and framed by impressive statues of its founding members. It was managed mostly by earth and wind mages, who'd joined healing guilds after reaching the rank of master. The marble entrance had vaulted ceilings and walls that were painted with a brilliant powder blue. As we approached, a young healer waited for us. My eyes widened at the dark splotches of blood on her simple white dress. Behind her, the halls were crowded with beds of the injured, which was unusual in itself. Few injuries required more than a few simple healing sigils or potions and a day's rest. I'd never seen the infirmary so crowded. "I'm Clarence Rosewoodoo, here to see my Uncle Edmund." A spark of recognition flared in her green eyes. "And her?" She nodded doubtfully in my direction. "My intended," Clarence replied, his face softening. I need her with me. Otherwise, I fear I'll be unable to see my uncle. I've heard his condition is terrible." Clarence blinked a few times, and a tear rolled down his cheek. I worked hard to keep the grin off my face, despite the macabre setting. Who'd have thought boring, good boy Clarence would be so good at lying? The healer bowed her head and stepped aside. "That's fine, as long as you're quiet." "We can do that," Clarence replied, guiding me in. The infirmary was bare bones and sparse. White walls, white floors, and white beds, nearly all of which were filled. Clarence led me past several beds and drew up short by one. His grip on my arm tightened, his knuckles becoming white. When I gazed at the man prone in the bed before us, I threw a hand over my mouth to muffle my startled squeak. Edmund Rosewoodoo had been a handsome man once, but now his face and neck were gray, nearly ashen, held together with row after row of black stitches and bandages. Raised veins pulsed and seeped dark fluid over his skin, cracked like a broken doll's. His right arm was black and ashy, as if he'd contracted the plague. I felt myself grow numb as Clarence released my arm. He raised a hand and tenderly brushed his fingers over his uncle's bare scalp, once covered with thick hair. "He's going to die," Clarence murmured. "And for what?" "He might pull through," I said without conviction. "Uncle Edmund," Clarence whispered, kneeling at the man's side. "Can you hear me? I swear. I'm beginning to wonder if my family is cursed." "Clarence? Bella?" a voice rasped. I turned my head sharply to the right. It took me too long to recognize the bruised and bloody figure lying in the bed. "Alfred?" I asked. Our classmate nodded weakly. He drew in a sharp, ragged breath. Like Edmund, Alfred's skin pulsed with black fluid. My chest ached. This was Alfred, my childhood crush. He'd kissed me once, when we were 12. He'd always been so roguish and lively, and now he was broken and injured. And he was only 19, the same age as Clarence and a year older than me. What kind of enemy could have done this? The more I looked at him, the more I saw. His eyes were glassy and distant, and although I moved closer, Alfred's gaze didn't follow me. "What happened to you?" Clarence asked softly. "They aren't what you think," Alfred murmured. The elementals. This one was a goat. A damn goat." "A goat?" I glanced at Clarence, who looked as baffled as I was. "He's raving," I murmured, feeling his feverish forehead. The pain must be too much for him. Everyone knew that elementals didn't really exist. They were stories for children, mythical embodiments of natural forces, left over from a simpler time before humans learned how to control magic. Hisses whirled in the air around me, accompanied by a burst of violent rage that made me stagger backwards. "Arabella?" Clarence asked. The ground rushed towards my face as magic flared around me, dragging me down like an anchor around my neck. Clarence wrapped an arm around my waist and held me against his chest. The magic inside me changed, becoming a muddling of anger and dismay. These weren't my thoughts or my emotions. But then, whose were they? My calf prickled as the ice-cold gem of my wand pressed against my leg. My eyes widened in panic as I remembered what Gertrude had said about my wand being stubborn, as if it were a conscious entity. The truth hit me like a hammer, and I felt it ripple through my body as if cracking apart my flesh. Somehow magic could hear me, and it didn't like what I was saying. "Clarence," I said, pain jolting unevenly through my temple. Take me home. Now. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind whirred with fragments of information that refused to fit together. I'd been wrong about everything. I'd thought instinctive magic responded to my emotions. It always came easier when I was angry or frustrated. But now I knew. Magic didn't just respond to my emotions. It had emotions of its own. But how could we be fighting elementals, creatures of myth and legend, and for what purpose? Finally, I abandoned my bedroom and slipped downstairs into the library, my wand in one hand and a lit candle in the other. The manor had lights, activated by turning a series of gears embedded into the walls, but those were too bright and would be more likely to draw attention. I set the candle and wand on a nearby table and stood back, craning my head upwards. As a master on the Council of Mages, my father had an impressive collection of books about magic. I scanned them with my eyes before spotting a leather-bound volume, trimmed in gold. The gilded title, Elementals and Magic, gleamed in the darkness. With a frown, I grasped the ladder and pulled it along the metal track attached to the shelves. Then, I climbed, balancing carefully as I ascended several feet into the air. Finally, I plucked the book from its place, nearly falling from the weight of it. But I kept my balance, tucked the book against my chest, and slowly descended. Once I reached the ground, I placed the book on the table and swore quietly. A metal lock kept the front and back covers firmly closed. The key was likely in my father's study. I took the book with me, holding it and my wand with one arm. In my free hand, I held the candle aloft, its light cutting the darkness as I padded into my father's study. The moon cast the hallways in a silvery light as my bare feet tread quietly against the polished wood floors. I placed the book on my father's desk, careful not to jostle the mountain of papers. My eyes fell on the device, and I lifted the candle, inspecting it more closely. It looked a bit like an overly elaborate clock or an astrolabe, made of gears, jewels, and bands of different metals. I bit the inside of my cheek and wondered at the purpose of this strange device, and how it was tied to the secretive and dangerous war. With a sigh, I opened the drawer on his desk, digging through an impressive tangle of discarded parts and nameless gadgets until I found the telltale shine of a key. I grabbed it and wedged it in the lock, which refused to give. I rifled around until I found another and tried it. Then another. With a growl, I shut the drawers quietly, glaring at the book. It was infuriating to be so close to the answers I sought, only to have them locked behind such a simple mechanism. I sucked in a deep breath as whispers filled the room. At first I thought it was the staff, and prepared to duck my head under the desk. When nobody materialized, I picked up my wand and studied it carefully. It was almost like it was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't discern the words. I pointed it cautiously at the book, letting my frustration pour through me. The air chilled around me, turning my breath into a misty cloud. It hovered above the lock, before condensing into jagged crystals of ice. For a moment, I was tempted to toss a cup of water at it, and split apart the binding with ice like Master Brookshire had done with the mug. But I knew it would only destroy the book, along with any answers it held inside. Normally, I would have gone straight to Father and demanded answers, but he'd made it all too clear recently that he was too busy for me and had no inclination to share his secrets. I glared at the stubborn machine in the center of the room. If only he could finish it, maybe he'd be happy again. Maybe it would help Resverie end this foolish war. Maybe I wouldn't have to marry Clarence. Maybe everything would go back to normal. I crawled towards the gleaming metal, scraping my knees against the rough carpet. "I don't know exactly what you do," I whispered, pointing my wand towards it. "But I know you're important, and that my father is a good man. Whatever he's building you for, I know there's a reason, and if he fails, more people are going to suffer. So please, please, just let his invention work." I clenched the wand between both hands, almost like a prayer. Then suddenly, the sapphire shone brightly, lighting up the room. Hisses hummed in the back of my head, followed by the faintest hint of a woman's voice. I nearly jumped. The hisses, whatever they were, weren't me. It was the magic itself, which had a voice. I took a steadying breath and closed my eyes, letting myself sink deeper into the waves of power. Some terrible, solemn truth, only half realized, seemed to linger at the edge of my awareness. Excitement stirred up in me as soft clicks and whirs hummed from the machine. Something was happening. But then the candle blew out suddenly, leaving me in darkness so complete I wondered if I'd imagined everything. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, so pressing that my knees shook. With a sigh, I gathered my candle and wand and sneaked back to my room. Belatedly, I realized I'd left the book, but I could no longer bring myself to care. Chapter 4. Bells, bells! My father's shouts burst into my bedroom and broke through my early morning drowsiness. I darted away from Jane, my lady's maid, who attempted every morning to put my hair into some order. Panic set in as I remembered the night before, cursing myself for leaving the book in his office. Had I damaged his device? Was he angry? I rushed down the stairs, my blue skirt streaming behind me. My father met me halfway and put his hands around my waist. A sharp squeak tore from my throat as he picked me up and swung me around. "Did you do something to it?" he asked. His voice was grave and solemn, but an inner smile beamed through his eyes. "No," I lied, unwilling to commit myself before I knew what exactly I was being accused of. "What is it, Father? What's happened?" He grabbed my hand and pulled me after him, across the sleek floors until we arrived in his office. With a triumphant grin, my father urged me forward. The bronze, bejeweled device floated over my father's desk. Colors twinkled from the colored gems, shining like stars. I waved my hand beneath it, looking for hidden wires or mechanisms, but found none. "Is it supposed to do that?" I asked. "Yes, by the gods. This is exactly what it was supposed to do. This will solve everything. You'll see." He pulled me in closer, squeezing me so tightly I couldn't draw breath. "I told you it would work," I said, smiling into his shoulder. His joy was infectious. I still didn't know why the device mattered so much, but I was glad he was happy. I placed a soft kiss on his cheek. "I'm going to be late," I said, pulling away reluctantly. Father swung me around once more and kissed my forehead. "Tell Roderick it was my fault. He'll be kinder to you." I patted my father's forearm and skipped away. "I'm not worried about Brookshire," I said with a grin, flipping my hair. "How can anyone stay angry at someone as charming as me?" During class, Brookshire had us practice the steps to creating ice. This involved moving your feet a certain way, flicking your wand just right, and focusing on your breathing. At first, I tried to follow his directions and ignored the hum of the magic coursing through me. The steady beat was a physical pull, like gravity. I could almost hear it whispering, "Give in. Give up." I was so relieved my father had finally succeeded, I almost complied. And why not? I wasn't sure what, if anything, I'd actually done, other than ask nicely. Maybe magic wasn't the dangerous force everyone thought it was, which responded only to control and discipline. Brookshire strode to my side and gently lifted my forearm, making minute adjustments to my stance. My knees ached from bending them so much. Although I no longer drenched myself with rain, I had yet to make the coveted ice. And whenever I practiced the ritualistic gestures like Brookshire wanted, my body felt stiff and foreign. "You're doing well," Brookshire said, just a little more gracefully. "Flick your wrist and loosen your grip. And then, shift your weight. It's like a dance. You can dance, can't you?" I scoffed at the suggestion. Every noble learned dancing from an early age for events and balls. I'd never been particularly graceful, but I could follow the beat of the music. Maybe magic was more like dancing than I realized. My eyes widened a little as I realized I could already hear its rhythm. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Clarence twist his wrist and unleash a delicate burst of water droplets into the air. His dark eyes narrowed in concentration, and his lips slightly parted. Clarence's face was so intense and focused that a little tremor spread through me. The magic stirred, hissing around me. I flicked my wrist, trying to flow smoothly through the steps and positions. But rather than forcing my wand to obey, this time I let it lead. I felt like we had an understanding now, a growing mutual respect. Water droplets formed from the tip of my wand, and when I spun around, sparkling steams of water formed around me. For an instant, they remained in the air, before bursting apart into flakes of snow and drifting slowly to the ground. "Excellent," Brookshire said. "You're getting there. Just remember to focus. You want the exact movements to be just right." I nodded and looked again at Clarence. His face seemed pale and his eyes tired, and the blonde stubble along his jaw indicated he'd neglected his shaving. When Clarence caught me looking, he flashed me a smile, but it faded quickly when the ground started shaking. It wasn't the gentle rocking or subtle vibration, like the earthquakes I'd grown up with. This one struck like a gong, toppling books from shelves and knocking several of my classmates off their feet. I darted for cover beneath my desk and covered my head. A scream punctured the sound of breaking glass as the shaking increased, growing to a frantic pitch. My heart was in my throat, and blood roared in my ears. It seemed to take an eternity for the shaking to finally stop. And in the silence that followed, Brookshire cleared his throat. His face and knuckles had gone white as he clung to the corners of his desk, like a captain piloting a ship through a fierce storm. "Now that our concentration has been so thoroughly diverted," he said quietly, "I suppose that's enough class for today." Most of my classmates took the Quakey in stride, gathering their things quickly and fleeing the room before Brookshire could change his mind. I slowly rose to my feet, my legs shaking uneasily. "They're getting worse," Clarence murmured, helping me up. "Bigger and more frequent." "We've always had quakes," I said, "but nothing like that. Why now?" There was something in Clarence's eyes. Did he know more than he was saying? Clarence offered his elbow, and after a second's hesitation, I put my hand on the crook of his arm. In my other hand, I clutched my wand like a fulcrum, as if it could restore my equilibrium. Together, we wove through the mass of our shaken classmates, eager to exit the building. It was less crowded than usual. Audrey was gone, as Clarence had predicted. I bit my lip and looked at the back of a tall, red-headed girl ahead of me. Although we rarely spoke, I knew all about her family. Annalise was the oldest of 8 children and the only daughter. She was a gifted mage. Would she be leaving next? "Uncle Edmund is dead," Clarence said once we were outside. He ran a hand over his face, glancing back at the academy. And Clarence's mother and aunt were still gone. He must be worried sick. A sudden fear pierced my heart. Clarence seemed so determined to succeed in class, but the moment he did, he'd be sent off to war. We both would. We stood awkwardly for a moment, both consumed by our thoughts. I'd usually excuse myself quickly after school, and I was eager to check on Jack after the earthquake, but part of me didn't want to leave him alone. "Clarence," I said, "why don't you come with me today? We'll do something daring, to keep your mind off it. Off everything." Clarence's face softened, becoming nearly shy, as if he was unused to being invited places. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, loosening the dark tie of his school uniform. "Well," I said slowly, "after class, I usually go to Elfenfoss. I practice my magic there, and I know some of the non-magicals." "That's very inappropriate for a young lady," he teased. "But Clarence—" I smiled coyly. "I'd love to accompany you," Clarence said. "It might be enjoyable. I've never spent much time outside of Seolford." "Then it's about time you started," I grinned. Clarence really wasn't that bad. and maybe he wasn't so boring either, if he was willing to do this with me. I wondered what Jack would make of him, and how Clarence would react to her sharp tongue. I'd never really had a friend before, and now I had two. I just hoped they'd get along. We drifted through the gates and left Seolford behind us. I glanced at Clarence as we entered the village, but he seemed distracted, scowling at the mud sucking at his dark leather shoes. But then he was a young man. He'd have been allowed to travel through the streets of Elfenfoss before, not hidden by curtains. There were less people than usual, but perhaps the earthquake had driven them indoors. "Oh, I forgot to tell you," I said suddenly. "That machine my father is working on, it works now. I haven't the faintest idea what it is, though. Something that levitates. If it's related to the war, I can't see how." "But isn't your father an inventor anyway? I mean, maybe he's just working on some minor project." "But he's never asked Gertrude to help him," I said. She and Dorothea came back from the battlefield to check on the progress of his device. Doesn't that seem strange to you? It has to be important, or linked to the war somehow. Clarence flexed his jaw, musing it over. I let it drop as we entered the inn. It was quiet, nearly empty save for a few people lingering at the long wooden tables, drinking from tankards. I crossed the room, bringing Clarence with me, and walked to the polished bar where Jack was polishing glasses. My smile faltered as her face hardened. "Princess," she greeted, snapping her eyes to Clarence. "I see you brought a prince with you this time. So much for secrecy." "He's my—" I trailed off. For some reasons, I didn't want to tell Jack that I was betrothed. "Her classmate," Clarence supplied. "And you are?" "Jack," she said, leaning over the bar and fixing him with an aggressive stare. Was she rude to everyone or just nobles? When she leaned like that, Jack showed a substantial amount of cleavage. I wondered if she was trying to make Clarence uncomfortable. "So, did you come to take more from us?" she asked, keeping her voice low and wiping her hands on a dish towel. "The food wasn't enough?" "What food?" I asked. Jack nodded, her eyes darting past Clarence and me. I followed her gaze and suddenly realized the distrustful looks Clarence and I drew. The men's faces were half hidden in shadow, but I could tell the mood had changed. Wary, hungry. The inn felt slightly dangerous, for the first time ever. "I guess you really don't know anything," Jack said. "What's happened to the food?" Clarence asked. "Who's taking it?" "Mages," Jack hissed. "Who else would it be? They're stockpiling the grain and cured meat and evacuating Elfenfoss. I've heard they're sending us northward, and they say the food will be shipped to us there. Took all my ale yesterday and left me with this useless slip of paper," she said, slapping it on the table. It was a receipt with the king's seal on it. "Maybe to send to the troops?" Clarence guessed. "But why would they evacuate?" I asked. "Unless the fight was coming here?" I paled at the thought, my mind flitting back to the charred bodies at the infirmary. "The earthquakes," Clarence said suddenly. "They haven't been getting bigger. They've been getting closer." "They said it was to protect us from the earthquakes." Jack nodded, wiping off another mug. "Didn't really believe them, though. The mages have always looked out for their own." "They're just trying to protect you," I said. "If the king did this, he must have a good reason. And don't worry, there's plenty of food at our estate. I'll bring you some next time I visit." Jack reeled back like I'd slapped her. "And what about everyone else?" she growled. "Sure, I'll just eat fig pudding and dumplings while I watch my friends and family starve. That's the difference between us and nobles like you. You don't care about anyone else's problems but your own. Mages take what they want and give nothing back." "That's not true," I said. I knew there were mages who used their magic to help regulate the crops and the weather, and others who visited the clinic in the village to help the sick. Maybe it was true that most mages, myself included, had never paid much attention to the affairs of the village, but that didn't mean we didn't care. "Don't you get it? Not everyone grew up with a silver spoon in their mouth. If I can't sell ale, I've got no coin. No coin, and I can't buy bread, soup, blankets for the winter, nothing. We'll either freeze or starve to death, and my grandpa—" She choked back a sob. I reached out to her, but she shoved me away, looking ferocious. "Forget it," Jack said, turning her back on me. "I wouldn't expect a spoiled rich girl like you to understand." "Where did they take your supplies?" Clarence interrupted before the fight could escalate. "And when?" "Last night," Jack replied, crossing her arms. She raised one eyebrow skeptically. "They've been gathering and storing it somewhere beneath the city, but it's guarded." "I bet we can get in," he smirked. "What do you say, princess?" he asked, picking up Jack's nickname for me. "Shall we retrieve your friend's ale for her? You did say you wanted to do something daring." My eyes widened, and for the first time since I'd known him, I found myself not completely opposed to marrying Clarence Rosewoodoo. My heart pounded as Jack led the way through Elfenfoss and along the walls of Seolford, which extended around the base of a steep hill. She crouched down near the tree line, ducking behind the crumbling remains of an old stone fence. It was well past dusk now, and we were easily hidden in the dark shadows. "There," she pointed. Set into the rock, a cellar-like door seemed to lead underground. 2 armored guards stood by the entrance, their swords glinting in the yellow torchlight. Soldiers were carrying crates into the tunnel. "This doesn't make any sense," Clarence said. "If the supplies are for the war, why are they stockpiling them beneath the city?" "Maybe they're preparing for a siege?" I asked. "But then why send the villagers away, instead of letting them into the city walls?" Jack pulled out a long kitchen knife, and I rolled my eyes at her. "They're the king's elite guards," I said, eyeing the seals on their uniform. "I know how to handle myself," Jack muttered. Metal hummed as Clarence loosened the sword in his sheath. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But if it does, I'll keep them occupied, while the 2 of you find what we're looking for." I crouched low in the bush, my wand ready. I didn't know how to fight, but maybe I could distract them. The king's guards were lower mages, but most used enchanted weapons rather than magic of their own. Plus, I'd done my fair share of sneaking around, and they'd never really hurt me, would they? If we got into too much trouble, I'd just tell them my father's name, though I was loath to do so. Clarence crept forward slowly, then he grabbed a stone and lobbed it towards one of the guards. It bounced harmlessly off his armor. "Hey, assholes!" Clarence said, standing up and waving. Then he darted across the path and jumped onto the rocks on the other side. I expected the soldiers to give chase, but they didn't. Instead, one looked at the other and smirked, raising his hand in a ball of flame. I sucked in a quick breath. Fire mages. The warning died in my throat as the soldier pulled his arm back and launched a torrent of fire that nipped at Clarence's ankles. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed the knife out of Jack's hands and tossed it as hard as I could, just as Godfrey had taught me years before. It sunk into the man's shoulder, and he stumbled back, with pain and shock in his eyes. His companion roared and charged towards us, embers already sparking between his outspread fingers. Jack shoved me out of the way, as if she could fight him off with her bare hands. He towered over her, grabbing her by the neck and lifting her off the ground. I screamed, beating my fists against his arm, but he wouldn't let her go. With a twisted grin, his bare hand started heating up until it burned into Jack's skin. I closed my eyes, breathing in deeply. Then I took a step forward and spun, echoing the steps I'd learned in class, giving myself to the magic. "Please," I whispered as I flicked my wand. Frost crackled along the ground, painting the grass white. It swept forward, freezing around the legs of the guard. I focused my instinct, concentrating on the man's hand until the glowing red faded. His eyes filled with fear as his fingers turned blue, and then white. When his fingers snapped off one by one, he screamed, clutching his wrist. The soldier stumbled away into the woods. I stared in shock at what I'd done. My pulse was pumping loudly between my ears. Somewhere between my shock and horror, there was another feeling, but it wasn't my own. Satisfaction. Pride. My wand seemed to thrive on violence and destruction. I hadn't meant to do it, or had I? I wanted the man stopped. I wanted to save Jack. Didn't I ask my wand for help? Even beg for it? "Let's go," Clarence ordered, between haggard pants of air. I let him pull me forward towards the tunnel entrance. Jack held me steady as Clarence pulled up the heavy metal doors with a groan. Then we ducked together into the darkness. Jack grabbed a torch from a bronze sconce on the wall and led the way forward. The tunnel widened out as it went deeper under the rock. The walls were reinforced with timber and even had a small cart system set up for moving supplies. "This isn't just for storage," Clarence said, as we passed yet another tunnel running perpendicular to the main one. "They must have been working on this for years. But what is it? And what's it for?" My head was still pounding from the exertion of magic, but I let my eyes drift over the high vaulted caverns as we passed through another large room. It was completely hollowed out, with tall pillars supporting the ceiling. So much empty space, I could almost feel the weight of Seolford above us. The first few halls were roughly chiseled straight out of the bedrock, but after we passed through several, we entered a grand hall with bas-relief sculptures and artistic flourishes. Then we came to a great metal door, decorated with murals and more reliefs. It looked almost like some kind of vault. As Clarence pulled the door open slowly, glowing blue light and curls of wispy smoke rose from beneath it. This chamber was similar to the others we'd passed through, except rather than being completely empty, this one was nearly full of crates, boxes, and even livestock, which gave it an earthy smell. Creeping up the tall pillars, blue crystals radiated a subtle, pulsing glow. The whispers were so loud here I almost reached up to cover my ears. Water dripped down the walls, making the floor slick, and in the middle of everything, a large mechanical device hummed, floating just above the ground. I gasped when I realized it was my father's bronze creation, only at a much larger scale. "What is this?" I whispered, my lips trembling. "Our salvation," a deep voice rumbled through the cavern. "Thanks to you." Then my father stepped from the shadows. He was dressed in a dark suit and a hooded cape, looking just like I'd seen him at home that morning, but the strange shadows of the hall and glowing lights made him appear strangely ominous. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of my father. "What are you doing here?" I asked, pushing Jack behind me into the shadows. "Don't be angry, Bells. I've been having a servant tail you for weeks now. Did you really think your hotel room in the village was a secret? It was actually rather convenient to have you distracted. But now that you're here, I suppose it's time you learned the truth." "The truth?" I repeated softly. The hisses rose around me, and inside my chest, my magic curled and tightened, like a snake about to strike. "I was going to tell you everything, once the device was finished, but we're already too late. It's begun." "What has?" Clarence asked. His voice echoed through the chamber. "Decades ago, astrologers predicted a great flood," my father said. "We cannot stop it. It will destroy all life on the planet and last for months, maybe years." The king approached the council, demanding solutions. I issued a proposal that, while well received, depended on a piece of technology I'd yet to develop. "The machine in your office," I nodded. "But what does it do?" "When the time comes," my father said, "we will sever our ties from the earth and raise our city into the skies. The device will lift the kingdom of Resverie into the heavens, the first flying kingdom." "That's insane," Clarence said. "The amount of energy it would take." "The war with the elementals." I breathed slowly, looking around at the glowing crystals in the chamber, and the dozens of gems studded into the spinning wheels of my father's machine. "You're not fighting them," Clarence said, catching on quickly. "You're capturing them. Properly contained, they produce consistent energy resources." Cold, sharp ice rushed into my veins. the chamber hissed, and thousands of crystals shimmering in the darkness. When I drew in a breath, I felt as though a knife had lodged in my throat. The wand. There's an elemental imprisoned within it, isn't there? I asked. The practice is not new, my father shrugged. Many enchanted objects and weaponry are powered by elementals, but due to the severity of the threat, we were forced portal into their dimension and harvest them for our purposes. Harvest them? I felt sick. But it's kidnapping, I murmured. Slavery. Don't be so dramatic, my father said. They're hardly more than animals. You don't complain when the cook breaks the chicken's neck, do you? Besides, it's the only solution. Bells, this flood is going to destroy everything and everyone. But now that the device works, the Crown has officially granted us passage. Father reached into a hidden pocket of his cloak and drew out 2 shining gold tickets. Don't you see? I did this all for you. We'll be saved, and you won't even have to marry Clarence. What? I whispered. The king and council agree that young couples are preferable citizens for this new kingdom. Because of her service, I knew Gertrude would receive tickets for her and her son. I thought that, in case something went wrong, or if another master created the engine first, an engagement to Clarence might be the only way to save your life. But now that my design works, it changes everything. We can survive together. You used my mother and me, Clarence said, his eyes narrowing. Surely, you aren't so upset, Father replied. This will ensure Bella's survival. What about everyone else? I asked. All the non-magicals? My father's smile faltered, and a knot formed in the pit of my stomach. We can't save everyone, he shrugged. It's a miracle we can save anyone at all. I believe the king intends to evacuate the non-magicals living nearby, so we can prevent potential violence from breaking out. So you're going to lie to them and make them leave their homes? I asked. They don't know about the flood. They think they're leaving to a better place, to a safer place, and... Anger curled in my belly, my icy fury swirling with the waves of magic rising within me. When I raked my hands through my hair, droplets of water materialized around me and froze, falling like hail. And that makes it worse, I retorted. You're stealing their food, I said, pointing to the crates and boxes around us. They won't need it, my father said coldly. You son of a bitch, Jack snarled, emerging from the shadows. I grabbed her wrist and held her back. They're good people, I shouted. Hard-working. Maybe they can help. We have to tell them, at least give them a chance to prepare. You can't tell anyone, my father said. There would be a mass panic, rioting. It would threaten the entire project. As for preparations, there is nothing they can do. Giving them time to consider their demise would only ensure greater misery. He's right, Clarence said quietly. Nobody can know. I felt as though he'd plunged a knife into my heart. The magic inside me leaped with my panic, twisting and whirling in waves. Damn traitor. Just when I was starting to like him. He reached for his sword and I felt Jack cower behind me. Run! I shouted, shoving her forward. I bolted after her. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed to get away. I followed Jack blindly as we raced through the labyrinthine network of tunnels beneath the city. A small part of me marveled that a lie this big could remain buried for so long. Even the earthquakes, I realized. They must have been drilling out these tunnels for most of my life, and I never even questioned it. I gasped for breath when we reached the entrance. Jack was already disappearing into the woods ahead. I called out after her, but my voice was ripped away by the vicious wind. My blood roared in my ears, and my pulse raced. There was water everywhere, as a heavy torrent of rain fell from the sky and bolted around me. I ran towards the village, but halted, wide-eyed before a train of people, led by a man in shining armor atop a tall, proud stallion. Lady Arabella, he exclaimed. By God, what happened to you? Algernon, I realized. I hadn't recognized him at first. I raised a shaky hand to my hair. It was drenched, and my skirts were wet and covered in mud. "You shouldn't be out here," Algernon hissed. "It isn't safe." My eyes darted through the village and the non-magicals who'd gathered to watch the train. Between two horses, there was a litter, veiled in black gauze. That meant only one thing. Someone had died. Someone important. This wasn't a parade. It was a funeral procession. A lone musician played a sad dirge on his lute. "Who is that?" I whispered, almost to myself. My heart pounded so loudly that its beat echoed in my head. Before Algernon could answer, a throat cleared behind me. I whirled around and beheld Gertrude Rosewoodoo, or what was left of her. The Countess's once fair face was now half covered in bandages, the skin around them red and dotted with blisters and sigils, which trailed beneath the thin silk tunic she wore. Beneath the thin fabric, I saw wads of bandages and blackened flesh. Her left eye was white and bulged out from a raw, burned socket. Her eyelashes and eyebrow were gone, along with vast clumps of her hair, exposing red and black wrinkled skin. Gertrude trembled so violently that I thought she might fall from her horse. Then she held herself up straighter, fixing me with her one good eye. "My sister," she rasped. "The last of my siblings." Chapter 5. I was too exhausted to refuse Algernon when he demanded to escort me home. I was shaking uncontrollably by the time Jane poured a hot bath for me. I barely remember crawling into my bed and falling asleep beneath the heavy blankets. The rain continued the next day, puddling in the streets and pounding on the great bronze dome of the Studium Generale. Father was willing to let swaths of people die, just so the mages could live. And worse, Clarence agreed with him. The only person in the world who might understand was Jack, and my father had forbidden me from leaving the city. Godfrey had been tasked with escorting me to the academy, and was instructed to bring me straight home afterwards. My one act of rebellion was to dig through my mother's closets for a black dress that matched my mood, but the lace felt stiff and itchy. I wanted to scream at everyone I passed in the halls. For everyone else, it was just another day of lectures. Students laughed and flirted in the hallways, worrying about exams and eager to prove themselves and join the war efforts. They had no idea what was coming. "You seem unfocused today," Brookshire said. "Perhaps you need to stretch out more. Put your weight on your toes. I know teleportation is a new concept, but I expect a better performance than this." "What's the point?" I thought, glaring at him. I had a feeling Brookshire was tasked with setting his students ridiculous challenges to keep them busy, while the council finalized their departure plans. I reluctantly moved into the position, and when Clarence shot me a concerned look, I frowned at him. Brookshire didn't seem to notice my ire, instead, moving to help Brigid Delacroix, who was always slower than the rest of us. "I'm sorry," Clarence murmured, moving closer to me. "I know you're disappointed in me." Disappointment didn't even begin to cover the range of emotions I was experiencing. A blanket of betrayal, helplessness, and rage clouded my thoughts so thoroughly I couldn't even formulate a response. So instead I spun around, performing the rigid movements with precision, and put all my anger into my casting. The magic whispered around me, and I sank into it. The world around me blurred into a maelstrom of colors and noise. The sapphire in my wand shone, and the world rippled like water. I pushed against it, and then I stood on the opposite side of the room. Clarence's dark eyes were wide, awed. You did it," Brookshire said. The man sounded baffled, and his eyes narrowed in suspicion. I'd done too well, and too quickly. I shriveled under the envious stares of my classmates, and my secrets burned inside me. Would all of them be saved, or only the most talented? Were they secretly on trial for their own lives? And why should I be forced to keep the council's secrets? I wasn't a council member. I was barely a mage. "A flood is coming," I blurted, straightening my back. "It's going to destroy everything." Brookshire's eyes widened, and color rose to his cheeks. I tipped my chin up in defiance. Some of my classmates laughed. Others looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. "We always have heavy rains around this time of year," Brookshire said, his smile indulgent. "There's no reason to think it's a flood, much less some cataclysmic event." Heat rushed to my face. Brookshire was a master on the council. He must know the truth. "Tell them," I snapped. "Tell them all of it. Tell them about how our classmates are all dying in this war, so we can enslave a race of elementals to lift us into the skies." Brookshire stiffened. I have no idea where you've heard such a thing." I stepped forward. "You know, and you're lying to them." Clarence reached for my arm, and I sprang back as if he'd burned me. Silently, I begged him with my eyes, hoping he'd relent and support me. Indecision flickered in his gaze. "Bella, I think you've used too much magic," he said at last. "Delirium is a common side effect." My eyes burned. I blinked back the angry tears and curled my hand so tightly around my wand that it hurt. No one said anything as I stared down the man who'd been chosen as my husband. But I didn't have to marry him, I thought bitterly. Not anymore. Because my father bought me a golden ticket, paid for with slave labor. If I hadn't made the machine work, none of this would be happening. "I hate you," I hissed. "Don't ever speak to me again." "That's enough," Brookshire roared, his temper finally snapping. "For God's sake!" He seized my arm, and I pulled reflexively against him as he dragged me from the room. With a flick of his wand, the classroom door closed behind us. Brookshire released me once outside, and I pressed my back against the wall. I breathed hard, steeling myself to argue and fight. "They won't believe you," Brookshire said quietly. "No matter how much you try to tell them. I don't know how you discovered the council's plan, but if you try and warn anyone else, I will personally ensure that you and your father are ferried out of the city, despite his considerable contributions. Would you really risk your father's life, as well as your own? You're a noble woman, so starting acting like one. Sometimes you must make sacrifices for the good of the kingdom." "If a kingdom would betray so many of its citizens, then maybe it doesn't deserve to be saved," I countered. Brookshire squeezed my arm, firmly but not painfully. I could feel the anxious flutter of energy around him as he struggled to keep his temper. He led me down the halls, past confused students and startled professors. A woman walked towards us, leaning on a cane, her appearance so startling that it took me a moment to recognize Gertrude Rosewoodoo. My eyes flashed to her burned face. Brookshire dug his fingers into my arm and leaned close to my face. "The deaths of the non-magicals are regrettable," he whispered, "but unavoidable. We simply cannot save everyone. But those elementals, the creatures you're so upset over being enslaved, they're the creatures who did that. She was such a beautiful woman, too. But she's so hideous now I can barely look at her." "She attacked them," I murmured. "They attacked us first," Brookshire hissed. "Are such creatures really worth your devotion?" I faltered, even as the magic of my wand, the powers of some enslaved elemental, hissed inside me, warning me. I couldn't trust the council. I couldn't trust anyone. "Can't you see what's happening? The magic has corrupted you. A young mage like you should never have been given such a strong spirit to wrestle with. It's no wonder it has addled your brain. If you still have doubts about the dangers of magic, maybe you need a closer look at the contests," Brookshire muttered. Gertrude paused when she saw us, and Brookshire approached, slowly clearing the space between us. "My lady," Brookshire said, painting a polite smile on his face. "How wonderful to see you." I clenched my jaw. What a snake, I thought, to be so ingratiating to her face and say vile things behind her back. "Shouldn't you be in class, Arabella?" Gertrude asked. "I'm sending her home," Brookshire replied. "I think the stress of the lessons is too much for her. She's sharing delusions about—" "The flood!" I exclaimed, deciding I'd rather take chances with her over Brookshire. "You know about it, don't you? Clarence must have told you." Clarence didn't need to tell me, Gertrude said quietly. Roderick, why don't I take Arabella with me? I'll escort her home. You need not trouble yourself with this, especially with your class waiting for you. I'll speak with her father and ensure this does not happen again. There was something malicious in Brookshire's face, something sadistic even, but I didn't know why it was there. Maybe he secretly enjoyed what happened to Gertrude. Or maybe he hated her. After all, she'd done what very few could and earned a title for her family. Very well, Brookshire said. I'm sure you'll ensure she stays out of mischief. Certainly, Gertrude replied. We'll return to the North-Hæven estate and trouble you no longer. Gertrude broke her promise almost immediately. Instead of taking me home, we went to the cemetery. It was through the main gates of the city, just on the edge of the woods above the village. Huddling under a dark umbrella, I watched silently as Gertrude stood before the freshly dug grave, her broad shoulders and back a stark outline against the dark and bloated clouds and the gray tombstones around us. Alienor, Gwenwyfar, Edmund, and Dorothea, all 4 of Gertrude's siblings, and even her husband were here buried now. Gertrude sighed. She'd dressed well today, in a crimson brocade gown and a matching hood, lined with pearls and rubies, but she leaned heavily on her rosewood cane, her blackened fingers curled around it like a lifeline. The unburned half of her face was wan and heavily lined, dark circles rimmed her bloodshot, unpainted eyes, and the few wisps of hair which had escaped the hood were limp and damp from the rainwater. Droplets of rain fell against her face and lingered, stuck in the new, uneven rivulets of the burned side of her face. I rubbed my forearms. Already, the water soaked through my cloak and dress. Are you cold? Gertrude asked. Only a little, I said. I waited, expecting her to chastise me about my outburst at the academy. She'd been so quiet since we'd left the Studium Generale, but somehow I found the quiet soothing. I felt the fresh, pine-scented air and raindrops siphon away my anger, until I felt more like myself. Dory was my favorite, although I shouldn't say that. Gertrude's breath broke off with a soft, plaintive sigh. I almost named Clarence after her. I wanted to name him Dorotheos or a variation of it. I always liked Dorian. Both names have been in our family for centuries, but I let Clarence's father convince me otherwise. I think Clarence suits him, I said quietly. He's a fine boy, she said absently. I frowned but didn't respond. A fine boy and a liar, just like all the mages. I thought of Jack, and my chest ached. Was she still in Elfenfoss with her grandfather, preparing for the flood somehow? Even if they managed to build a boat in time, they'd avoid drowning only to die a slow death of starvation. I couldn't bear to think about it. I swallowed down the lump in my throat and twisted my fingers in my cloak. You've been fighting and imprisoning elementals, I said finally, to power my father's machine. We all did, she said with a casual wave of her hand. And look where it's gotten us. Alie and Gwenny gave their lives to the cause, and all they received in return for their service was the posthumous title of Countess Rosewoodoo. The king couldn't even be damned to give us 3 different titles and pensions. He made us share one. Edmund and Dory received even less. And for what? To be trapped in the skies, on a floating prison. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until she responded, and I let it out now in a surprised huff. I'd been expecting her to deny it, or justify it like everyone else had. Instead, she seemed bitter and critical. So, you don't agree with what's happening? I asked. Whether I agree or not makes little difference, she said. It's done. Brookshire was right, you know, she said after a few moments. All this rage you're feeling, it isn't all your own. You're special, unlike most mages, more sympathetic to their voices. Magic always takes a physical toll, but it's easier when viewed as a force of nature that must be bent to our will. Isn't it? I asked. Don't lie to me. Gertrude's right eye shone with a dark fury. I know you can hear her. I sensed it in you just like your mother. It's a rare gift, I was hoping you'd pass it to my grandchildren eventually. I shivered, but not from the cold this time. The temperature seemed to have dropped suddenly, and my breath clouded in front of me. I'll tell you a secret, Gertrude continued. Magic is simple, at its core. The structure of the world is built by tiny atoms in constant flux. It's how these atoms come together that decides what we experience and perceive. But, and here's the secret, a strong enough will can influence how these atoms come together, or tear them apart. Mages can influence matter at an atomic level, but it takes a great deal of power. The easiest way to influence them is through love or hate, the most volatile emotions. But they can make you do irrational things, so the council discourages them. Oh, but if you must indulge in them, they prefer its hate. Because if you use love to power your magic, you still have to live with the guilt of what you've done. I've never heard that, I whispered. Did you know they have names? Gertrude asked, pointing to the wand in my hand. She's Johanna. Her home was in a cold, wintry place where the icy water met tall, snowy cliffs. When I met her, she was playing in the rain she'd created. She was powerful, but she didn't try to hurt me. And I still shot her, right at the base of her neck. I looked at my wand and traced my thumb over the sapphire set in the polished wood. Johanna. There was an elemental in my wand, and all my powers came from stolen magic. I looked at Gertrude, my eyes lingering unwillingly on the burns that covered her face and stretched across her neck before disappearing beneath her cloak. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. Trying to convince me to go? No, she smiled. I'm trying to explain why I must stay. The boiling anger, Johanna's anger, quieted, and without that rage, I felt numb. I knew I should argue, to insist that Gertrude save herself from the floodwaters, but she looked so tired and wounded that all the words died in my throat. I've carried this burden long enough. I've saved my race and my lineage, Gertrude said bitterly, by enslaving forces of nature and at the expense of my family. But I will die at peace. Die here? I whispered. Sure, I'd misheard her. Gertrude nodded sharply. She reached into her purse and withdrew the golden ticket. It gleamed like a firebrand between her thick, scarred fingers. Clarence will go and my servants will go, she said. But I'll stay here with my brother and sisters. Clarence will be devastated, I murmured. I know. Don't tell him, or he might do something drastic. He might want to stay with me, and I want him to survive. I want him to die old, surrounded by his loved ones. I'll miss you, I confessed quietly. Even though we hadn't spent much time together, I was drawn to her quiet strength. I wished I could be half as strong as her when I grew up. Was I brave enough to stay behind and die with her? Gertrude's lips twitched. She flipped the ticket again and handed it to me. Why waste it? She asked. You must have friends. Give it to someone who deserves it. I know you and your father will survive. You might even be rewarded for all the good you've done. I took the ticket and traced my thumbs over the writing. My thoughts turned immediately to Jack. If anyone deserved to survive, it was her. This could be her only chance. But would she leave her grandfather? Maybe. Maybe not. But I had to at least ask. I won't waste it, I said, gripping it tightly between my fingers. I know, Gertrude replied, gazing up at the bloated clouds. But you'd better hurry, Arabella. There isn't much time left. Thank you. I promise I'll look out for Clarence, as his wife or his friend. I know. But promise me that, if you marry and have children, you won't let my sister's name die out. Keep it in the family, so even if people forget her, there's some trace of her still in the world. For me, it's what my family has done since we came here. You know, reused the same names over and over. It's like we hope we'll get better with each name, as if it's some sort of spiritual rebirth. My chest ached. I felt like I should apologize for everything, but I couldn't force the words out. I'd really been so awful to her and Clarence in the beginning. I will, I finally croaked. For the first time since her return from battle, Gertrude smiled. Her right eye glistened with affection. Farewell, Arabella. Farewell, I said. As I walked away, I knew instinctively that this would be the last time I ever laid eyes on Gertrude Rosewoodoo. So I left her, standing in her scarlet gown before the graves of her beloved siblings. My right hand clenched tightly around the ticket, my left hand around the wand. I had to find Jack, and I had to find her now. Chapter 6. Slowly, I made my way down the hill, counting on the rain and the coming night to obscure my movements. The gates were guarded, so I edged along the walls of Seolford. I pulled the hood of my cloak over my hair as much as I could, trying to keep myself as dry as possible. I had to reach the village and make it back before they shut the gates for good. Once I was halfway down the hill, I sucked in a sharp breath as cold water gushed around my ankles. Ahead of me, half-submerged buildings rose above the waves like a nest of sea turtles. Slowly I descended, shivering as the water soaked through my clothes. By the time I reached Elfenfos, the water was already up to my waist. I clenched my jaw and waded through it. My heavy skirts clung to my body, dragging me down, but I persisted. The village was mostly empty, save for a few panicked villagers. A dog passed by, paddling upstream desperately. A mother placed a toddler in a makeshift raft, wiping tears from her eyes. The rain pounded as I waded through the torrent of water. It stretched across the whole town and further out into the woods. My father had warned me not to leave the city under any circumstances. I looked back at the gates of Seolford, biting my lip. How much time did I have? What if I was already too late? I clenched the ticket tightly in my pocket but pressed on until I reached the inn. The wooden sign had floated away. I pulled on the door, but it didn't budge. I swept out my wand, trying to draw the water away from the inn, and pushed against the door with my shoulder. It still refused to yield. "Jack!" I shouted, banging my fists against the door. "Jack!" The water kept rising, and the current threatened to pull my feet out from under me. I treaded against it, trying to keep myself afloat. After years by the sea, I was a strong swimmer, but this torrent was swifter than the tides I was used to. The current ripped around me, dragging me with it. I gripped the doorknob with one hand to keep from being whisked away. The water bubbled up to my chest, splashing water on my neck. I forced myself higher, keeping my head above the rushing waves. I whipped my head around, Seolford a dark blur in the distance. How was I going to make it back? "Princess!" My head jerked up. Jack was on the roof of the inn. She leaned over and extended a hand. As the water rose, I swam to her, using her arm as an anchor. I heaved myself onto the roof and gasped for breath like a fish out of water. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her eyes widening. Around us, the ground shook and sent the water lashing up the sides of the inn. She leaned over me, gripping my arms tightly. We didn't have much time left before the water swept over the roof. I fumbled into the bodice of my dress and withdrew the drenched golden ticket. "I can get you into Seolford," I said, between gulps for air. "But we have to go now." "But my grandpa?" Jack trailed off. My chest ached. I was about to ask her to do the exact thing I hated my father and Clarence for doing, deciding who lives and who dies. But somehow, the thought of having Jack with me made everything else seem bearable. "I know," I said, "but I can't save everyone. Only one person. I choose you." Jack's breath came harshly. "He was evacuated with the others to higher ground," she said. "I didn't even get the chance to say goodbye. He'd tell me to go, but I can't just leave. Not even if I know what will happen." "Jack, Water swirled around our feet. Jack jerked her head to the door on the roof. "I can't," she said, backing away. "I'm sorry, but I just can't." The air shifted, wood and stone creaked. Beneath my feet the inn rumbled. Suddenly the roof collapsed in. Jack screamed and began to fall. but I wrapped an arm around her waist and pulled her to me. Sound exploded behind us. It was like the earthquakes, but so much stronger. It was like the world was being ripped apart by the seams. I whipped around and stared as the world broke apart. Buildings collapsed one by one, washed by the current, smashed against the tall rocks surrounding the village. With an unearthly groan, Seolford began to rise, like a sleeping giant, shaking off dust and boulders as it lifted into the sky. I choked back a sob, realizing I was too late. The mages were leaving without me. Jack tore away from me and tried to rush to the collapsed part of the inn, but water rushed in, filling the space. I sunk to my knees, feeling hopelessness set in. Eyes wide and blurred by rain or tears, Jack stared at me. Her curly red hair hung in wet, limp strands around her face. "Why, princess?" she breathed. "Why risk your life? For me?" "Up there, you can make a difference," I said. "We can make sure the mages remember that all life is important, that everyone matters, regardless of birth or ability. If you die here, everything good, everything human, everything I love will be gone." I bit my lip. I'd said too much. But then she nodded fiercely and gripped my hand. "Then let's go," she shouted above the rushing waters. "If we can get to Seolford before they're out of reach, we can still make it." Although the roof was slick with water, she ran across it and jumped. Her feet landed solidly on the next building. I forced myself to my feet and tore away the heavy folds of my black dress until I was wearing a thin shift. It clung to my skin, but left my legs mostly bare. I took a deep breath and launched myself across the gap into Jack's arms. Together, we jumped across the remaining buildings of Elfenfoss, but I knew we were running out of time. Even atop the buildings, the water rushed around our ankles. Seolford was already at a higher elevation, and I was starting to see the light through the other side of the great crevice that separated it from the earth. All around us, the earth tore and crumbled with deafening shrieks. Once we reached the edge of the village, I tightened my grip on the wand and jumped into the water surrounding the city gates. The water was so cold it took my breath away, but my feet found their footing. I scrambled, racing upwards and fumbling against the ground beneath me. It was gorged with water and muddy, and my boots sank in with every step. Something struck my ankle and I jumped. A scream froze in my throat as I looked down and saw the frigid corpse of a non-magical. "Keep going," Jack snapped. I did, forcing my numb limbs into motion. Suddenly, cold burst against my back as a wave knocked me over. I was underwater, spinning with the current in the dark and cold and silent. My lungs burned and my pulse pounded between my ears. I was going to die here, helpless and alone. I heard urgent whispers from my wand and the cooling blue light from the sapphire. I wasn't alone, I realized. I twisted around and flicked my wrist. The magic and the waves around me felt the same, and fear burned in my chest that I might mistake one for the other. But then the water rushed away from me. I gasped for breath as my head burst up above the waves. Sound returned like a slap to the face. I wildly waved the wand, realizing I could control the direction of the current, just as stone filled my vision. My hip struck the walls of Seolford, and white stars danced in my vision. I grabbed the iron bars and hauled myself up to the flat, stone top of the city gates. Below, the bedrock beneath the city was revealed. Water was sucked into the once empty space, swirling around corpses and sewage. It was like a giant sinkhole, rimmed by the wall. Jack's scream split the air, and I looked around wildly trying to find her. I caught a glimpse of her dark figure as the water tossed her over the walls. She flailed and grabbed the inside of the city walls, trying to brace herself against them. I clawed my way towards her, but a section of the wall between us collapsed, tumbling away in giant chunks until we were separated by a raging waterfall. I waved my wand, and water swept aside, but it wasn't enough. There was no way across. The current pulled her further down, even as she clung to the wall, trying to keep from falling over the edge into the massive whirlpool. I tried swimming against the current, but another torrent of water forced me even further away. I drew in a heavy breath. "I'm coming!" I screamed with all my might. But it was useless. My arms and legs were numb and my chest burned. "Hold on!" I shouted. I dragged myself onto the wall and forced myself upright. My feet nearly swept out from under me as I stood, knees bent, atop the wall. I forced myself into the dancing steps. The air before me rippled, and the world fell away. There was no air, no color, no sound. When I broke through again, I'd teleported across the gap, but not far enough to reach her. Then the wall cracked, leaning under the force of the water. "No!" I screamed. I ran towards her across the top of the city gates, reaching out my hand. Bits of debris smashed into my shoulder, sending jolts of pain all the way down to my wrist and forcing me to my knees. "Stop! It's no use!" Jack shouted. She was barely audible above the rain and thunder. I screamed back at her and gasped as oily, putrid water rushed into my mouth. I sputtered and forced my head up. "I'll see you again in the next life, princess." And despite all the chaos swirling around us, Jack smiled. Then, the current tore apart the section of wall she clung to and pulled them both underwater. She disappeared over the edge of Seolford's walls and into the watery pit where the proud city once stood, with corpses and long-hidden bedrock swirling around her. Waves of water crashed over the walls of Seolford. I couldn't outrun the torrent of water rushing towards me. It swept me onto the wall once more, water clawing around me. Legs shaking, I moved into the starting position and flicked my wrist, silently pleading for the water to stop. But I couldn't force it back, and even as I watched, a new wave formed, growing higher and gaining strength as it drifted closer. Jagged boards of wood and bones rose with it. This was my death, coming to meet me. I drew in a breath, even though I knew it was futile. In moments, the water would drag me to a watery grave. Hisses erupted around my head, like a swarm of bees. Think of the person you love the most. The words, soft and feminine, thundered in my ears. The elemental, I realized. Johanna. It had to be her. My thoughts scattered and flitted through names and faces, and finally I felt like I'd figured it out. My heart thundered in my chest as the water rushed to me, sliding over the bronze and stone. I took a step forward, moving like I had in class, and thrust my wand forward. The magic responded, and I felt the energy flow and shift through me. My muscles ached and my nose burned. Then the water was upon me. I screamed and turned my head, but the air shimmered. Before me, the water crystallized, crackles of frost blooming like white, delicate flowers. Snow swept around me on both sides, as my chest heaved, trying frantically to draw in air. Somehow I'd frozen the wave into an icy shield. Boom! An ear-shattering shriek split the air. I ducked beneath the ice as the water swept on. My temporary shelter wouldn't hold for long. Debris floated with the tide. A door. I ran along the wall, my boots struggling to find purchase on the sleek surface. Behind me, ice cracked and split. I jumped, gripping my wand so tightly that it hurt. The frigid water cut through my clothes and down to my bones. With my free hand, I seized the door and hauled myself up just as it went over the edge of the wall. For a moment, I was falling. The wooden door bucked beneath the water, but bobbed back up quickly. I gasped for air as the water swept my makeshift raft along, into the rising lake where Seolford once was. I was passing too deep under its shadow, but I couldn't force myself back. The flying city loomed above me, out of reach and growing further away by the second. A shout split the air, and black shape fell. I shifted on the door. A basket. Someone had dropped a basket. I swung the wand, directing the current. Water swept around me, the door beneath my feet careening wildly as I forced myself nearer to the basket. Once I was a few feet away, a figure appeared. It was Clarence, his blonde hair flattened against his face and his clothes drenched and clinging to him. As I dove from the door, his hand grasped my forearm. My head struck the side of the basket, and I fumbled wildly. "Come on," he shouted. "We're going up." I struggled and kicked, hanging in open space as the remaining buildings vanished beneath me. Then, with a burst of energy, I heaved myself in. Clarence tugged on a rope, and we went higher and higher. I gasped for air. My hands shook, and my wand clattered to the bottom of the basket before the wood split into 2 pieces. Clarence crouched beside me, putting his face close to mine. "You came back for me," I whispered. He hugged me close to his chest and pressed his lips to my hair. "Of course, I came back for you. My mother didn't raise a coward." His mother was dead now, and he likely didn't know. "Clarence." "It's all right," Clarence murmured. "You're all right. You made it." I stifled a sob. My numb fingers sought out the sapphire. "I broke my wand," I whispered. It was a stupid thing to say, but all my senses and feelings seemed numb and distant. The blurry form of Seolford came into view, hands stretched forward, pulling the basket up. I found my father, who pulled me into a hug the second my feet reached even ground. Clarence kept his hands close to me, helping me to stand. Father and the servants were all here, at the edge of the city, now nothing more than a rough cliff overlooking the flat horizon, still dripping water as the broken fountains gushed freely. There seemed to be too many people and too few at the same time. Lord Algernon, Godfrey, even Jane. Relief fought with remorse in my breast as I coughed and took rasping breaths. Jack was dead. Gertrude, too. And all the non-magicals who were forced away under false pretenses. I swallowed past the lump in my throat and pressed myself against Clarence. I didn't love him, but maybe I could learn to, in time. I held the sapphire, caressing its smooth surface with my thumb. Water rushed beneath us, and my fingers curled more tightly around the stone. "Thank you," I whispered. And as we watched, the water rose over what was left of the bronze domes and grand walls of Seolford. The trees vanished beneath the torrent of water, the green lost beneath the froths of foam and rushing streams of blue. Then, the world was gone entirely. We were all that remained, a floating kingdom, illuminated by the full moon as it rose behind us, drifting into the bloated clouds above. If you liked this story, keep reading. This prequel is just the beginning of a sweeping, epic fantasy series of floating cities, royal intrigue, demonic powers, and a uniquely dystopian future. All 3 books are available now. Start with the first book, The Source of Magic, or save money with the full box set. You might also like Scarlet Thread. When I touch people, I see how they die. A thrilling urban fantasy based on Greek mythology. Taste of Vampire. Being chosen by an elite prince should have been a privilege, but it cost me everything. A dystopian vampire fantasy mashup. Shearwater. Mermaids are real, and they want to kill us all. A brooding fantasy set in Ireland. A long and absorbing tale based on mythology. Prison Fae. Kidnapped by a brutal Fae prince, forced to fight in fairy games. A gritty, modern urban fantasy. Look for them on Amazon or get a free sample chapter on our YouTube channel.